Hello, everyone. I am the narrator, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The silence in an empty office building is never complete. It breathes with mechanical whispers, the hum of servers, the occasional click of a thermostat, the distant groan of the elevator shaft settling. But silence has texture, and after 3 months of working late at Carson Financial, I had learned to read its patterns like Braille, which is why when the footsteps began, I knew immediately they didn't belong. The clock on my monitor read 2:17 a.m. when I first heard it, a soft measured cadence echoing down the corridor outside my office. Tap, 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 3 steps, then silence. I dismissed it as the building's night custodian, though I couldn't recall ever seeing anyone clean this late. The deadline for the Miller portfolio loomed over me like a guillotine, and I had more pressing concerns than investigating random noises. But at 2:24 a.m., it came again. Tap, 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 5 steps. This time I frowned, fingers hovering over my keyboard. Something about the precision of those footfalls set my teeth on edge. Each step landed with identical pressure, spaced at mathematically perfect intervals. No human walks with such mechanical consistency. I returned to my spreadsheets, but my concentration had fractured the Fibonacci sequence I was working with, kept morphing into footstep patterns in my mind at 2:33 a.m. The sound returned. Tap, 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 tap. 8 steps. My skin prickled with gooseflesh. The progression was unmistakable. 358. The Fibonacci sequence. I'm a financial analyst, not a mathematician, but patterns are the backbone of my profession. Coincidences exist, but not coincidences this precise. I rose from my chair and approached my office door, hesitating with my hand on the knob. The rational part of my brain insisted I'd find a perfectly mundane explanation. Perhaps an automated cleaning robot with peculiar programming, but something deeper, something primal warned me to stay put. I compromised by peering through the narrow vertical window in my door. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, illuminated by the sickly glow of emergency lighting. Nothing moved in that pallid corridor, yet the memory of those footsteps lingered in my ears like an echo. When I returned to my desk, I opened a new spreadsheet and titled it Sounds. If there was a pattern here, I would document it, analyze it, understand it. Understanding dispels fear. That's what my father always said at 2:44 a.m. Tap, 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 tap. 13 steps. My hands trembled as I typed the number into my spreadsheet. The Fibonacci sequence continued 3, 5, 8, 13, but it wasn't just the number of steps that disturbed me. The timing between these events, 7 minutes, 9 minutes. 11 minutes was also following a pattern. The intervals were increasing by 2 each time I stared at my screen, my throat constricting. If the pattern held, the next set of footsteps would come at 2:57 a.m. and consist of 21 steps. Part of me wanted to pack up my things and leave to dismiss this as sleep-deprived paranoia, but another part, the analyst, the pattern seeker, needed to know if my prediction would prove correct. 2:57 a.m. arrived with suffocating slowness. I sat rigid in my chair, eyes fixed on the door ears, straining against the silence. Then with clockwork precision, tap, tap, tap. I counted each footfall silently, my heart accelerating with each number. When the 21st step fell, a cold sweat had broken across my forehead. The footsteps had come exactly when and how I'd predicted. I began to document everything. The precise time between steps, 0.78 seconds. The acoustic quality of each footfall like leather on marble. Though our floors were carpeted, the direction always moving from east to west, never returning. I even recorded the sounds on my phone, though. Listening to the playback made my skin crawl. There was something subtly wrong with the recording. The footsteps sounded more distant, more hollow, as if they were falling in some space adjacent to, but not quite within our reality. By 4:30 a.m., I had logged 7 sequences of footsteps. Each followed the Fibonacci progression perfectly, and each arrived after an interval that increased by 2 minutes. The number of steps had reached 233. I calculated that the next sequence would involve 377 steps and take nearly 5 minutes to complete, but the pattern contained more than just numbers. Beneath the surface, data lurked a deeper structure, a mathematical language encoding information. As a financial analyst, I recognized the telltale signatures of information transfer. These weren't random patterns, they were communication. I began mapping the intervals between individual steps within each sequence. The micro patterns formed what looked like a three-dimensional matrix. When visualized by 5 a.m., I'd written an algorithm to translate these patterns into spatial coordinates. The result looked like nonsense at first, a series of points floating in three-dimensional space until I connected them. The blood drained from my face as I stared at my monitor. The connected points formed a shape resembling a tunnel or a corridor extending from a single point and gradually widening with each new sequence of footsteps. The corridor grew longer. It was 5:13 a.m. when I realized the corridor on my screen aligned perfectly with the actual hallway outside my office. Something was mapping our physical space from elsewhere. The realization hit me with such force that I knocked my coffee mug to the floor, where it shattered with a crash that seemed obscenely loud. In the quiet building, the sound momentarily broke my trance, and I became aware of my physical state. My shirt clung to my back with sweat. My breathing came in shallow gasps. My hands shook with fine tremors. I needed to leave now before the next sequence began. I grabbed my coat and laptop, but as I reached for my phone, the first step of the eighth sequence fell. Tap, I froze, listening to the perfect mechanical rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Each sound felt closer than the last sequence, though I knew that was impossible. The hallway wasn't long enough to accommodate 377 continuous steps at a steady pace, unless the hallway itself was changing. The thought struck me with such clarity that I abandoned my phone and went to the door instead through the narrow window. I could see that something was wrong with the corridor. It no longer terminated at the elevator bank 50 feet away. Instead, it seemed to stretch onward, the emergency lights receding into a vanishing point that shouldn't have existed on the 34th floor of an office building. I stumbled backward, colliding with my desk. This wasn't possible. I was hallucinating from exhaustion, or perhaps I'd fallen asleep at my desk and was caught in some vivid nightmare. I pinched my arm hard enough to leave a mark, but the impossible hallway remained when I looked again. The footsteps continued their inexorable count, tap, tap, tap. Each one seemed to distort the corridor further, stretching it like taffy into some impossible geometry. The emergency lights flickered, and in the momentary darkness, I thought I saw something moving at the far end of the hallway, a suggestion of mass and form that didn't translate properly into three-dimensional space. I slammed my back against my office door and fumbled with my phone, dialing security. The night guard answered, his voice thick with boredom, when I asked if he heard the footsteps or saw the distorted hallway on his security feed. He responded with confusion. According to him, the corridor outside my office appeared completely normal, empty and undistorted. He promised to come check, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. He thought I was sleep-deprived or intoxicated while waiting. I returned to my computer. The three-dimensional model had evolved, showing the corridor extending far beyond the physical confines of the building. But there was something else, a second structure emerging in the model, a shape moving through the corridor from its furthest point. Advancing with each sequence of steps, the shape defied classification. It existed in more than 3 dimensions, and my software could only render a shadow of its true form, a series of intersecting planes and angles that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that hurt my eyes to follow. But one thing was clear: it was approaching. That's when I began to understand the footsteps weren't just mapping our reality, they were thinning it. Each perfectly timed step weakened the membrane between dimensions, creating a passage. The mathematical pattern wasn't random. It was a precise formula for transdimensional travel, a key turning in a lock. I couldn't see the security guard. Never arrived when I tried calling again. The phone rang endlessly with no answer. I was alone with the footsteps, now well over 200 in their count, and the growing certainty that something ancient and utterly alien was walking toward me from another reality. I had two choices: flee through the distorted hallway, or stay and face whatever emerged. Neither option seemed particularly survivable, but as I stared at my computer screen, a third possibility suggested itself. If the pattern of steps was creating this breach, then disrupting the pattern might seal it. The footsteps had reached 300 of their predicted 377. I had precious little time. I grabbed my phone and accessed a sound engineering app I'd used for a presentation last year. Working frantically, I isolated the exact acoustic signature of the footsteps from my recording and inverted the waveform, creating a cancellation pattern. Playing it would be useless. The footsteps weren't sound waves, but mathematical constructs manifesting as sound. I needed something physical, something that could introduce a counter pattern into the sequence. My eyes fell on the office fire alarm. The building's alarm system operated on a precisely timed pulse, a regular burst of sound at 0.5-second intervals. If I could trigger it at exactly the right moment, it would create a disruptive interference pattern against the 0.78-second intervals of the footsteps. I watched my screen counting down when the 321st step fell. I grabbed the fire alarm handle and pulled with all my strength. The shriek of the alarm shattered the perfect rhythm of the footsteps through my office window. I saw the extended corridor seem to vibrate its impossible length, contracting like a release spring. Something at the far end, something my mind couldn't quite process, seemed to writhe in confusion or pain. The alarm's pulse beat against the footstep pattern, creating nodes of destructive interference on my computer screen. The three-dimensional model began to collapse, the tunnel contracting the approaching shape, retreating. I pressed my face against the door window, watching as the hallway snapped back to its normal dimensions with such violence that I felt the building shudder beneath my feet. The emergency lights flickered rapidly, then stabilized. The elevator bank reappeared where it belonged, solid and mundane. The footsteps had stopped in their place. Came the sound of confused voices and doors opening. As my few fellow night workers responded to the fire alarm, someone shouted about evacuation protocols. The night security guard appeared at the end of the corridor, looking annoyed and fully corporeal. I sank to the floor, my back against the door, lungs burning from breaths. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my laptop chimed with a system error. The modeling program had crashed. Taking my dimensional calculations with it, all that remained was the original spreadsheet with its record of step counts and intervals as people began to file past my office toward the emergency stairs. I quickly saved the spreadsheet to a secure cloud folder. I would need it as evidence of what had happened, proof for myself, if no one else, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The building evacuation took nearly an hour. Fire services came and went, finding no sign of fire management, sent everyone home for the day while they investigated the alarm trigger. I joined the crowd of irritated employees heading to the parking garage, my laptop clutched tightly against my chest. I haven't returned to the office since that night. I called in sick, then took vacation days, and finally submitted my resignation. The Miller portfolio remains unfinished. My career and financial analysis is likely over. Instead, I spend my days in a small apartment far from downtown. Analyzing the data I salvaged, the pattern was incomplete. Whatever was coming through didn't make it, but the breach was only temporarily sealed. The mathematics suggest it will try again, perhaps somewhere else. Using a different sequence, sometimes at night, I think I hear distant footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They follow no pattern. I can discern just the random comingings and goings of my neighbors. But I've installed sound monitoring equipment just in case, set to alert me if it detects any precise repeating intervals. I've tried contacting mathematics professors, physicists, even parapsychologists. But none take me seriously. They see a man who had a nervous breakdown, not someone who glimpsed the thin dimensional barriers that separate our reality from others. So I watch and I listen and I prepare because, while I disrupted the pattern, once I'm not certain I could do it again, and whatever was coming through that corridor, that ancient patient intelligence with its precise and terrible footsteps hasn't given up. It's still walking, still counting, still coming. And mathematics is a universal language story. Two, there's a theory that certain frequencies exist beyond our perception, vibrating in spaces we can't access. I never believed it until I heard the voice. Just 3 words at first: get out now, buried in the background. Noise of a track I was mixing, 3 words that would irrevocably alter my existence, that would make me question the boundary between sound and consciousness, between what we hear and what hears us. I first noticed the anomaly on a Tuesday night while working late in my home studio. The deadline for my latest film score loomed just days away, and I'd been pushing myself to the brink of exhaustion, fueled by nothing but black coffee and desperate ambition. My career had been stagnating for years, and this project represented a rare opportunity to break through a psychological thriller for an up-and-coming director who'd taken a chance on me. Despite my fading reputation, the clock on my digital audio workstation read 3:17 a.m. when I played back the haunting string arrangement. I'd been laboring over as something felt off about the recording. I'd used a combination of live instruments and digital samples, but there was a strange texture in the mix that I couldn't place. I slipped my headphones back on, closed my eyes, and focused. That's when I heard it for the first time. Get out. Now the words emerged from the background. Noise barely audible but distinctly human. My eyes snapped open, pulse quickening as I stared at the waveform display. The voice didn't register on the visual representation of the audio. I removed my headphones, the sudden silence of the room pressing against my ears. My apartment felt different. Somehow colder observed, I convinced myself I was hallucinating from exhaustion. The human brain is hardwired to find patterns in randomness, to hear words in white noise. I'd read about this phenomenon, how our minds construct meaning from chaos. It was nothing more than auditory pareidolia. I reasoned, coupled with sleep deprivation and the pressure of the deadline, I exported the track without further investigation and went to bed the next day. I returned to the studio refreshed, ready to tackle the next cue. I'd almost forgotten about the voice until I opened the previous night's session to reference a motif playing back the exported file. I heard nothing unusual at first, but when I soloed the string section and boosted certain frequencies, there it was. Again, why are you still here? You were warned. My stomach tightened into a knot. The voice was clearer now, more articulate, with a sibilant quality that made my skin crawl. It wasn't my imagination. Something or someone had contaminated my recording. The rational explanation was that my equipment had picked up radio interference or cross signals with another recording device. I'd heard stories of old analog systems accidentally capturing radio broadcasts, telephone conversations, even baby monitors. But my setup was entirely digital, isolated from external signals built specifically to prevent such interference. I spent hours analyzing the audio running it through spectrum analyzers and noise reduction software. According to every metric, there was nothing unusual about the recording yet. When I played it back, the voice remained undeniable and increasingly coherent. My fascination quickly evolved into obsession. I abandoned work on the film score and began deliberately trying to capture more of these anomalous audio artifacts. I recorded hours of ambient room noise, leaving my microphones running while I slept while I was away, testing different components and configurations of my equipment. The results were disturbing. Not only did I continue to capture voices, but they became increasingly complex and conversational. They asked questions about my equipment, commented on changes I'd made to my setup, even referred to conversations I'd had with myself when I thought I was alone. One recording captured a voice describing with unsettling accuracy a nightmare I'd had the previous night, but had told no one about. I needed someone else to hear it. To confirm I wasn't losing my mind, I called Marcus, a sound engineer friend who'd helped me set up my studio years ago. He arrived the next afternoon, clearly concerned by the urgency in my voice when I'd called. I played him the recordings, watching his face intently for a reaction. His expression remained neutral as he listened. Eventually, shaking his head apologetically, he suggested I'd been working too hard, that my ears were fatigued. When I insisted, growing increasingly agitated, he humored me by running his own analysis on the files. He found nothing to him. There was only music and the natural room tone of my studio. After he left, promising to check back on me in a few days, I sat in the crushing silence of my studio, questioning my sanity. Then my monitor speakers crackled to life without being powered on. A voice louder than ever before filled the room. He can't hear us. Not everyone is attuned to our frequency, but you are. You've always been sensitive to us even before you knew we existed. My heart hammered against my ribs as sweat beaded on my forehead. I wasn't crazy. The voices were real, but for some reason only I could hear them. I questioned the voice, directly asking what it wanted from me. The response came immediately, bypassing my speakers entirely and seeming to materialize inside my head. "We need a conductor, a translator, someone to bridge our world with yours." That night, I discovered that my equipment wasn't just receiving these transmissions, it was communicating with entities that existed as pure sound beings that inhabited frequencies just beyond normal human perception. My digital audio workstation served as a conduit, a doorway between dimensions, separated not by space but by sound. They explained in fragments across multiple recordings that they had existed alongside humanity for millennia, occasionally crossing over through sensitive individuals, musicians, composers, sound engineers. What humans interpreted as divine inspiration or artistic genius was often their influence seeping through. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt a perverse sense of privilege. I'd been chosen, my stagnating career suddenly felt like necessary preparation for this. Moment this revelation, they promised to help me create music, unlike anything the world had ever heard. Compositions that would affect listeners on a profound neurological level, and they delivered under their guidance. My work transformed. The score I'd been struggling with flowed from my fingers, effortlessly infused with harmonic structures and micro-onal variations that seemed to bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to something deeper. When I presented the completed work to the director, he sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't explain why the music affected him so powerfully. He just knew it was perfect. The film was a critical sensation with numerous reviews, specifically highlighting the hypnotic, transcendent quality of the score. Offers for new projects flooded in. For the first time in my career, I could be selective, choosing only projects that my new collaborators approved of. It was during my third project under their influence that I began to understand their true purpose. I noticed patterns in the frequencies. They encouraged me to use modulations that, when analyzed, mathematically formed complex structures. They weren't just creating emotionally resonant music, they were encoding messages within the sound itself, processes these patterns subconsciously. They explained each composition was planting seeds, preparing listeners for what they called the harmonization, a synchronization of human consciousness. Through sound, my music was being used to create a network of minds attuned to their frequency. Individuals who would become more receptive to direct communication from these entities. The realization should have horrified me, but by then I was too deeply immersed in their world, too dependent on their guidance. My own thoughts had become intertwined with theirs until I could no longer distinguish between my creativity and their influence. My success, my renewed sense of purpose, all of it stemmed from them as my music spread across streaming platforms, film screenings, and public spaces. I monitored its effects through social media. Listeners reported intense emotional responses, vivid dreams featuring sounds they couldn't describe, and a strange sense of connection to others who had heard the same compositions. Some claimed they could hear whispers beneath the music, voices speaking directly to them. The network was growing. I convinced myself this was beneficial, a new form of human connection facilitated by these advanced beings. They assured me they meant no harm, that they merely sought symbiosis with humanity. But late at night, in rare moments of clarity, when their voices temporarily receded, doubts crept in. What if I was being manipulated? What if this harmonization was actually a form of colonization, an invasion through sound? During one such moment of lucidity, I discovered something that shattered the last of my complacence. Hidden in my digital audio workstation's temporary files was a folder I didn't remember creating, containing compositions I had no recollection of working on. These weren't film scores or commissioned works. They were functional sounds designed for public address systems, elevator music, hold music for telephone services, streaming platform intros, and other ubiquitous audio environments. The entities had been using my credentials, my professional identity, to distribute their encoded messages through the most pervasive channels imaginable, reaching millions who would never knowingly listen to my film scores. The scope of their plan was far more extensive than I had imagined that night. I destroyed my studio. I smashed monitors, dismantled computers, shredded cables, anything that could serve as a conduit for their voices. My hands bled as I tore equipment from the walls, my throat raw from screaming counterfrequencies I instinctively believed might disrupt their transmission. The neighbors called the police, who found me huddled in the corner of the destroyed room babbling about frequencies and mind control. I spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility diagnosed with acute psychosis, triggered by professional pressure and sleep deprivation. The doctors were kind but firm in their interpretation of my experience. I had suffered a break from reality, constructing an elaborate delusion to explain my sudden professional success after years of struggle without access to my equipment. Without the constant whisper of their guidance, my thoughts gradually cleared. I began to consider the possibility that the doctors were right. Perhaps I had created these entities as personifications of my own repressed creativity, my fear of success, my desire for external validation. When I was released, I moved to a small apartment in another city, leaving my professional connections behind. I avoided all forms of electronic sound equipment, listening only to acoustic instruments played live for 6 months. I heard nothing unusual, no voices, no entities. I began to rebuild my life, taking a job, teaching music theory. At a small community college yesterday, one of my students brought in a composition to show me a piece she'd created using a consumer-grade digital audio workstation, similar to the professional system I'd once used, as she played it back on her laptop. My blood froze in my veins beneath her simple melody, barely perceptible but unmistakable. To my trained ear was a familiar pattern, a signature I recognized immediately. They had found someone new, someone else attuned to their frequency, and based on the composition structure, they were much further along in their manipulation than I had been when I first discovered them. I should warn her, I should destroy her laptop, report my findings to someone with authority, try again to make people understand what's happening. But who would believe me, a former film composer with a recent psychiatric history, claiming that sound itself is being weaponized by interdimensional entities? As I sit here writing this, I've come to a disturbing realization. Perhaps I was never special. Perhaps I was just one node in their growing network, one conductor among many. Maybe they're spreading through home studios and bedroom producers across the world, leveraging our cultural obsession with content creation and digital distribution. I've started hearing them again, not through speakers or headphones, but directly, as if my auditory processing has been permanently altered to detect their frequency. They're closer now, more pervasive than before. They whisper that resistance is futile, that the harmonization is inevitable, that sound travels everywhere, touches everyone. Sometimes in the dead of night, I catch myself humming melodies. I don't recognize complex, haunting progressions that make my skin tingle with recognition. I try to stop, but the patterns repeat, embedding themselves deeper into my consciousness. With each iteration, I wonder how many others are out there right now, unknowingly serving as conductors in this growing symphony of influence. I wonder if someday soon we'll all be connected through these frequencies, a vast network of minds synchronized to their rhythm, attuned to their purpose. And I wonder if by then we'll even remember what our own thoughts sounded like. The harmonization is coming, and there's nowhere you can go that sound won't follow. Story 3, the vibrations came first. Subtle tremors through the floorboards that I dismissed as the settling of an old building. Then the sounds began faint at first, like whispers from another room, but unmistakable in the dead of night, the rhythmic clink of metal chains dragging across pavement, and the hollow clop of hooves striking stone. Impossible sounds for the 10th floor of a high-rise apartment complex in downtown Portland. Yet night after night, they persisted, growing louder, more insistent, as if something outside my window was demanding to be acknowledged. 3 weeks ago, I received an email from an unknown sender with the subject line, "Warning 1012 Westbrook Heights negative energy convergence." I almost deleted it as spam, but something about the specificity of my address caught my attention. The message was brief and cryptic. "Your residence exists at a nexus point of historical trauma, the boundaries between worlds. Thin where blood has saturated soil, Listen carefully. What begins as sound will manifest. Physically protect yourself before the gateway fully forms. I forwarded it to the building manager with a joke about our haunted building. His response was unexpectedly terse, suggesting I ignore internet trolls and assuring me the building had passed all inspections. Something in his hurried dismissal left me uneasy. That night I heard the chains for the first time. It was just after 3 a.m. when I jolted awake, my skin slick with cold sweat. Despite the autumn chill, the sound was distant but distinct, metal links scraping against concrete, punctuated by the slow, deliberate clop of hooves. My apartment faced an empty courtyard. There were no horses in downtown Portland, and certainly none 10 stories up. I pressed my ear against the window glass but heard nothing. When I returned to bed, the sounds resumed as if they only existed when not directly observed by morning. I'd convinced myself it was a dream, or perhaps some peculiar acoustical phenomenon bouncing sounds from street level. The human mind excels at rationalization. The second night the sounds returned more distinctly, chain links rattling against each other, hooves striking pavement with increasing urgency. I recorded it on my phone, but the playback revealed only static. A technical glitch, I told myself, ignoring how my hands trembled as I deleted the file. During the following week, I researched the history of the land beneath our building. The library archives revealed that before the apartment complex, the site had housed a furniture warehouse, and before that, a textile factory dating back to the early 1900s. Nothing sinister, nothing to explain the growing dread that followed me through my daily routines. Found myself avoiding my apartment, staying late at the office. Accepting dinner invitations I would normally decline. The sounds evolved, becoming more complex each night. What began as simple chains and hooves expanded into a grotesque symphony. I heard the creak of wooden structures being assembled, the metallic squeal of mechanisms being tightened, and underneath it all, a sound I wouldn't identify, something between a whimper and a moan multiplied and layered upon itself. 10 days after the first email, I received a second message. The portal strengthens. Historical echoes become physical reality when sufficient acoustic resonance is achieved. They are using sound to rebuild their gateway. Research the Westbrook Gallows, 1867-1892. My online search yielded nothing about gallows, but I found references to Judge Westbrook, a notorious 19th century figure known for his harsh sentences. The neighborhood had once been called Westbrook Commons. The connection was tenuous, but my mouth went dry as I contemplated the implications. I visited the Historical Society. The next day, claiming to be researching a novel, the elderly archivist studied me with narrowed eyes before retrieving a thin folder labeled Westbrook Public Punishments. Most of these records were destroyed in the fire of 1907, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Officials at the time claimed it was to modernize record keeping, but rumors suggested they wanted certain aspects of the city's history erased. The surviving documents confirmed my worst fears. For 25 years, the site had hosted public executions and punishment spectacles. The gallows were just the centerpiece of what amounted to a theater of cruelty, complete with pillories, whipping posts, and elaborate mechanisms designed to extend suffering for the entertainment of crowds that sometimes numbered in the thousands. They called it Justice Square. The archivist added, watching my reaction carefully, but locals had another name for it. The symphony of screams, supposedly on execution days. The sounds could be heard for miles. I thanked her with a mouth so dry it felt lined with cotton, and left the weight of this knowledge pressing down on my shoulders. The city had built luxury apartments on top of a torture ground, covering the blood-soaked earth with concrete and steel, but offering no acknowledgement, no atonement. That night, the acoustic manifestations reached a new level of clarity. I could distinguish individual components. Now the architect of this macabre symphony, arranging each element with precision. The cracking of whips, the turning of gears, the murmur of a crowd growing increasingly excited. No longer coming from outside my window, the sound seemed to emanate from within the very walls, as if the building itself had become a massive speaker, vibrating with the resonance of past horrors. My body responded with primal fear. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I feared they might crack. Sweat poured from me. Despite the cold soaking my sheets, my breath came in shallow gasps that never seemed to fill my lungs when I tried to stand. My legs buckled beneath me, muscles seizing with the instinctual need to flee what the rational mind could not accept. I crawled to the bathroom and vomited until nothing remained but bitter bile in the mirror. My reflection looked foreign eyes, too wide, skin too pale, a stranger wearing my face but transformed by terror. I needed confirmation I wasn't losing my mind. The neighbor across the hall, an insomniac graduate student, answered my desperate knocking with irritation that quickly shifted to concern. I asked if she had heard anything unusual at night. Her expression of confused pity told me everything before she even spoke. She heard nothing. No chains, no hooves, no symphony of torture, just the normal sounds of the city at night. She suggested carbon monoxide poisoning, or perhaps I should see someone about auditory hallucinations. I nodded and retreated, knowing how I must appear, disheveled, wild-eyed, reeking of fierce sweat. As her door closed, I caught her reaching for her phone, likely to report a disturbance. I couldn't blame her back in my apartment. The sounds had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt artificial, as if the world outside my walls had ceased to exist. I collapsed into bed exhaustion, finally overcoming terror, and fell into a dreamless sleep. The next morning I discovered the first physical manifestation. A thin layer of dirt covered my living room floor. Not the dust of neglected housekeeping, but actual soil, dark and rich, forming a perfect circle approximately 6 feet in diameter. When I touched it, the dirt was cold and damp, as if recently excavated from deep underground. More disturbing still, it contained fragments of what appeared to be bone, small weathered pieces. I refused to examine closely. I swept it up, dumped it down the garbage chute, and scrubbed the floor until my hands were raw. Later that day, I contacted a realtor about breaking my lease, citing urgent family matters. The earliest I could move was in 3 weeks. I considered getting a hotel room, but couldn't afford an extended stay on top of rent. I purchased sleeping pills, noise, and selling headphones, blackout curtains, anything to create a barrier between myself and whatever was trying to break through. None of it helped. The noises became louder, more insistent, pushing through all my defenses 2 nights ago. I awoke to find my furniture rearranged. Every piece had been pushed against the walls, clearing the center of the room where the dirt had appeared. In that space now stood a crude outline formed of rust-cold dust, the rough shape of a gallows. My throat constricted at the sight, a pressure around my neck that wasn't entirely psychosomatic. I tried to disperse the outline with my foot, but the dust clung to the floor as if magnetized. Last night I witnessed the culmination of their efforts. The sounds reached a crescendo around midnight. No longer just historical echoes, but a deliberate construction. Each component of the acoustic architecture locked into place with terrible precision. The temperature in my apartment plummeted, my breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. The center of my living room floor began to ripple like the surface of a pond, disturbed by a stone. The hardwood seemed to lose solidity, becoming fluid, reflective from its depths. Shadows moved indistinct at first, then with increasing definition. Human shapes, dozens of them pressing upward as if against a membrane. Their features distorted, but their intentions, clear hands reached toward the barrier, testing its resilience. I retreated to the farthest corner of the room, pressing myself against the wall as if I could phase through it. My entire body convulsed with tremors. I couldn't control the rational part of my brain, shut down entirely, leaving only the animal instinct for survival. Screaming through every nerve ending, a face pressed against the barrier from below. Features twisted in an expression between rage and ecstatic anticipation. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, and though I heard nothing, I felt the vibration of its scream through the floorboards beneath my feet. More faces joined the first, a mosaic of contorted visages, all focused on me with terrible recognition, as if they had been waiting specifically for my presence. The barrier between worlds stretched thinner, becoming transparent. I could see now what lay beneath. Not some metaphysical hell, but the historical reality of what had once existed here. The gallows platform, the mechanisms of torture, the eager crowd. History attempting to reclaim its space in the present. In my panic, I remembered something from my research. Acoustic standing waves can be disrupted by introducing counterharmonics with shaking hands. I connected my phone to my speakers and played the loudest, most discordant music I could find at maximum volume. The effect was immediate. The membrane rippled violently, the faces beneath it contorting in what appeared to be pain or frustration. The temperature fluctuated wildly as the portal fought to maintain integrity. I grabbed my emergency backpack and fled the apartment, the cacophony of my impromptu countermeasure. Following me down the hallway, I spent the night in my car parked under bright streetlights in a 24-hour store parking lot. This morning I returned only long enough to grab essential documents and a change of clothes. The portal had receded, leaving behind a perfect circle of scorched flooring. Tonight will be worse. They're learning adapting their acoustic architecture to overcome resistance. The barrier grows thinner with each attempt. I'm writing this from a coffee shop across town, hoping that distance might weaken their ability to reach me, but I can still feel the vibrations, subtle tremors through the table beneath my hands, the faint but unmistakable sound of chains dragging across pavement just at the edge of hearing. My apartment isn't the portal I am. They've been using the acoustics to attune me to make me a conduit. I found a motel 50 miles away where I'll stay tonight, but I don't believe it will make a difference. The chains will follow. The symphony will continue. The gateway will open. And when it does, I'll face what comes through. Not with counterharmonics this time, but with acknowledgement. These souls don't seek vengeance. They seek recognition, remembrance. Their suffering was erased from history, built over and forgotten. Perhaps that is the true unfinished business, keeping them bound to this place tomorrow. I'll contact the Historical Society about establishing a proper memorial. It's a long shot, but maybe by acknowledging the past, I can close the acoustic gateway before it fully forms for now. Though I sit in this unfamiliar room listening as the first faint clink of chains begins outside my window 10 feet above the parking lot, impossibly close and growing closer. Story 4, I still feel a chill run up my spine. Whenever I recall that first evening, the air in the office had turned strangely stagnant, making every breath feel stifled. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows against the walls. I remember looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was there, only to find empty corridors. By then, most of my coworkers had left, and the entire place resembled a labyrinth of silent cubicles and half-lit conference rooms. Something felt undeniably wrong. My name is Ryan Grant, and I work technically in the administrative department of a major consulting company. I used to consider myself rational calm under pressure, the type of person who double-checks everything before jumping to conclusions, but that night changed everything I believed about logic and reason. I had always prided myself on having a clear mind, but when I saw that stranger walk into the conference room, after hours, my sense of reality began to bend in ways I never thought possible. Let me start from the beginning. I was staying late to finalize a set of financial reports. I heard the subtle click of a door somewhere down the hallway, which puzzled me because everyone else had gone home. At first, I ignored it, assuming maybe the cleaning staff had arrived earlier than usual, yet the hush that followed dragged on uncomfortably, as if whoever had opened the door was standing very still. Listening, my heart gave a slight lurch in my chest. For a moment, the entire building seemed suspended in that single moment of quiet. I decided to check the conference area because it was supposed to be locked. At that hour when I arrived, the door was slightly ajar and the overhead lights were on. I distinctly recall feeling my pulse thrumming in my ears, my palms clammy as I pushed the door open. A man in a dark suit stood at the far end of the table, his back turned. His posture was rigid, and he seemed to be staring at the company's projector screen, which displayed an idle blue glow. I felt compelled to speak, but the words died in my throat, replaced by a nervous dryness that left my mouth parched. I took a shaky step forward, wanting to ask if I could help him before I managed to utter a sound. He moved. No, it was more like he flickered toward the opposite wall. almost too fast for my eyes to track my breath. Caught and my skin prickled with goosebumps, I blinked and realized he was gone. The conference room was empty again, the overhead light still humming. I told myself it was a trick of my imagination, the result of a long workday. My entire body buzzed with adrenaline, though, and I couldn't ignore how my chest pounded or how the small hairs on my neck refused to lie flat still. I shut the lights off, locked the door, and forced myself to breathe slowly on my way out. I noticed the cleaning staff's cart down the hallway, but no one was around. The echo of my footsteps felt far too loud. The next morning, I dismissed the incident as stress-induced, but when I sat down at my desk and opened the files I had saved the night before, I found entire paragraphs replaced by nonsensical symbols. Some data columns had reversed themselves, and email timestamps were altered. Nobody else reported a system issue, and our IT department insisted everything was functioning normally. I felt a cold tension creeping into my gut. How could there be no trace of a system glitch? I tried to tell my manager in an indirect way, but they seemed too busy to pay much attention. It wasn't a direct conversation, more like a passing remark about strange file corruptions. My manager responded with a vague assurance that any software issue would be handled, then rushed off to another meeting that left me feeling alone with my concerns, unsure if I was already crossing into paranoia later that evening. I stayed behind again, determined to confirm whether the stranger would return. I felt increasingly anxious as time passed. Around 8 p.m. The main office light switched into power-saving mode, and that suffocating stillness descended once more. My breath quickened. I found myself hyper-aware of every soft click and hum from the ventilation system. My heartbeat throbbed in my temples. Something about the emptiness made my legs jittery, like they wanted to bolt yet were rooted in place. Then I heard it, the door to the conference room squeaking open. My mouth went dry as I approached footsteps betraying my presence on the linoleum. I peeked through the small glass panel and saw him again. The same man in a dark suit expression concealed by the shadows. His movements were oddly fluid. As he ran a hand across the meeting table in a moment of bravado, I opened the door and demanded to know who he was. My voice sounded thin and strained, even to my own ears. He turned just slightly, and I managed to glimpse a hint of his face in the flickering overhead light. That fraction of a look made my pulse hammer. His features seemed blurred, not quite aligning with the bone structure beneath, as though his skin wasn't resting correctly on his body. He began to speak, but it came out garbled, like a distorted recording. The only coherent phrase I caught was something about unfinished obligations. Then he vanished before my eyes, leaving behind a faint shimmer in the air that dissolved almost instantly. I could hardly breathe. My entire body trembled with shock, and a cold sweat dotted my forehead. I had to grip the back of a chair to steady myself over the next week. Peculiar occurrences continued. Sent emails were rearranged to convey conflicting messages. Confidential spreadsheets were rearranged in ways that made no logical sense. I overheard a coworker mention receiving odd phone calls where no one spoke, just a low humming or static. I kept these observations mostly to myself. I was beginning to question my own sanity, wondering if my exhaustion had led me into some bizarre hallucination. Yet each time I convinced myself it wasn't real, I would discover more tampered files or half-glimpsed movements in hallways that should have been deserted one night. I worked late on purpose, determined to gather proof. I set up my phone to record the conference room from a discreet corner. My plan was straightforward. If the stranger appeared again, I'd have evidence hours dragged on, and I found myself drifting in and out of a restless state. My muscles were tense to the point of aching, and I couldn't shake the constant tingling in my fingers. Finally, around 10 p.m., I heard the metallic click of the conference room door again. My throat clenched as I watched the man's silhouette pace around the table through the glass panel. Taking shallow breaths, I reminded myself not to panic. My phone was capturing everything, or so I hoped. I forced myself to watch for several minutes. The man lifted the conference phone, pressed some buttons, and set it back down. Then, as had happened before, he abruptly disappeared. No trace of him remained when I checked the recording. All I found was static yet faint shapes flickered in and out of frame, accompanied by that same low hum I'd heard described by my coworker. I replayed it multiple times, heart pounding faster with each viewing. Toward the end, the distortion on screen formed something akin to silhouettes more than one. The shapes flickered so quickly I couldn't be certain, but it looked like a small group of figures standing side by side, all facing the camera. By that point, I was drenched in sweat, my pulse drumming. I nearly dropped my phone in alarm. I began digging into the company's history. It was rumor and speculation mostly, but a few older employees spoke in hushed tones about a catastrophic incident. From years ago, official records were incomplete, nothing explicitly stating what had happened. Only vague references to an unfortunate event. Some people implied that a group of workers had simply never returned after a malfunction in a new facility. Others insisted the entire story was corporate myth. No one had a definite explanation, but everyone seemed to share a quiet apprehension as if it was safer not to pry obsessive to find answers. I checked archived documents at the library, anything that might shed light on the nature of this rumored accident. The more I uncovered, the more I realized something had been carefully swept under the rug. Certain articles hinted at an experiment or perhaps a new industrial process that went wrong, causing employees involved to go missing under highly secretive circumstances. It was never acknowledged openly in official statements from the company. Dodged direct questions, I couldn't find specifics. All I had were suspicious gaps in the records as these revelations sank in. My tension escalated, my heartbeat felt perpetually unsettled, skipping in a frantic rhythm if I let my mind wander. My appetite vanished, replaced by a nauseous churning. The building itself felt different to me, as though it watched my every move. Some corridors seemed to stretch longer than I remembered my reflection in glass windows. Occasionally looked slightly askew, eyes flicking from side to side. Even when I stood still, I was no longer sure if I was witnessing actual anomalies or just losing my grip on what was real. A crucial turning point came one evening when I decided to re-examine the digital logs of our office's security system for hours. I scrolled through timestamps, comparing them to my experiences. Strangely, the logs showed no entries. For those times I had heard the door open, it was as if the intruder bypassed the system entirely. Then I noticed new lines of data had been inserted into random days, referencing non-existent visitors. The more I pored over them, the more they formed a pattern, a hidden code of some sort. My chest tightened as a dreadful realization dawned on me. This being, or perhaps multiple beings, were rewriting not only spreadsheets, but the very data that documented their presence. I confronted an IT specialist, quietly avoiding any direct accusation, just asking if they had noticed weird anomalies. They shrugged, looking uncomfortable, and hinted that some things are best left alone. My skin prickled at their tone. It was neither casual nor reassuring. It felt like a subtle warning. One night, determined to break this cycle, I cornered the cleaning staff and inquired if they had seen anything unusual. One of them admitted in halting words that they sometimes caught glimpses of shadows moving in corners or flickers in the reflection of the polished floors, shapes that disappeared the moment they turned to look. It matched my experiences perfectly. This wasn't a simple hallucination with a renewed sense of urgency. I convinced myself to watch the distorted footage from my phone in detail, hoping to decode the shapes as I sat in the lonely break room, the overhead fluorescent flickering. I replayed it frame by frame. My heart thudded violently in my chest and my breath grew ragged. Every muscle felt taut and a swarm of goosebumps raced up my arms. At one point, the interference formed a series of flickering lines that almost resembled letters. I paused, it reversed it, tried to stabilize the distortion. Eventually, a single word emerged. Return. Something inside me twisted. I had the sensation of being pulled deeper into an invisible vortex. These intruders were more than just one strange man. They were a collective presence intricately connected to an incident the company had buried. It felt as if they wanted to re-inhabit the space that had once belonged to them, or perhaps to reclaim something stolen. My mind reeled at the possibilities. I remembered the final part of that rumor, that the missing staff never reappeared and no official explanation was given. Though no one spoke about them openly, I realized these apparitions might be the manifestation of whatever had truly happened. The frustration, betrayal, and confusion left behind had taken a tangible form, now weaving itself into the digital frameworks and physical corners of the building, unable to continue living in that perpetual dread. I devised a plan, gather enough evidence of these manipulations to confront the company's upper management. However, as I prepared a thorough report with screenshots of corrupted data and carefully noted anomalies, the documents kept changing each time I opened them. Entire sections rearranged themselves. It was as though the entity was mocking my attempts at exposure, rewriting the narrative in real time. By the final night I spent there, I was teetering on the edge of panic. My breathing was shallow and fast, and I felt faint. Every hallway seemed angled wrong, as if the geometry itself had shifted. Lights dimmed without warning. The echo of my own footsteps sounded distant, like I was walking on a stage floor beneath which something vast and alive stirred. I stumbled into the conference room for one last stand. Flipping on every light, I caught my reflection in the glossy table and barely recognized myself. Pale, sweaty eyes wild with fear, a surge of static charged the air. I shuddered as that dark-suited figure materialized across the table. My heart hammered so fiercely I thought it would burst several other silhouettes. Faint and transparent hovered behind him. Their faces were hazy, morphing in and out of focus. I tried to speak but could only manage a choked whisper. Despite my terror, I felt a strange empathy. It was like they were reaching out silently, conveying their unresolved fury. Then the room blinked out for a second. I stood in total darkness, the hum of electronics gone. I felt a whisper of air brush past me, cold against the beads of sweat on my neck. When the light snapped back, the man in the suit was gone and the conference room was intact, as though nothing had happened. But I knew differently. I could feel in my bones that something fundamental had changed. I realized the entire office was a stage for their presence, a place they had been bound to ever since the company buried the truth. I fled that night, stumbling through corridors until I made it to my car. My hands trembled so violently that I had trouble fitting the key into the ignition during the drive home. Every passing streetlight felt oppressive, as though the shadows were chasing me. My stomach churned, and my mind replayed images of those blurred faces like a broken record. I never returned to that building. I sent an anonymous tip to the press, attaching fragments of footage and cryptic screenshots. Whether they'll make sense of it or not is unclear. Part of me worries that nobody will believe it. Part of me worries about what that presence might do if the company tries to hide it again. Even now, I sense the echoes of what I experienced whenever I stare too long at a flickering screen or catch a glimpse of my reflection in a darkened window. My heart still beats faster at the memory of the intangible shapes and cold sweat dots. My temples at the faintest creak in an empty room, though I've managed to escape that claustrophobic office. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The paranoia lingers. I find myself checking my phone for abnormal static or strange distortions in photos, sometimes late at night. I'll catch a flicker on my computer screen and my throat tightens with dread. Perhaps they remain woven into the digital threads of communication, waiting for the right moment to resurface, and that is the most unsettling part. The knowledge that their story remains unfinished, just like the disturbing residue they left behind on my recordings. They demanded a return, a reclamation of something taken from them if they once haunted only that building. Who's to say they cannot extend their reach? I close my eyes, heart pounding, mind whirring in spirals of fear. The last thing I see before sleep pulls me under is the image of that faceless man standing in the conference room, blurred at the edges, a silent harbinger of truths that refuse to remain buried. Story 5. I remember the first time I heard it. A harsh, ragged yell that sliced through the silence of my living room like a blade. The sound carried my name, clear and forceful, right against my ear, though I was alone in the house. In that moment, I felt my heart punch the inside of my rib cage, and a cold rush of panic rippled through my veins. I spun around, expecting to find someone looming behind me. Nothing, just my familiar lamp casting an anemic glow across the bare walls. That was the second the terror took root, a splinter in my mind that I couldn't ignore or extract. Little did I know this was merely the start of a steady, relentless unspooling of my reality. From the outside, my house seems normal enough. A modest two-story structure with creaking floorboards and a yard that refuses to grow anything but patchy grass. I've never felt entirely comfortable here, though. The walls seem too thin, the windows let in too little light, and there's an almost imperceptible odor in the air that I can't quite identify, something damp and stale like wet cement left too long in the dark. Despite the discomfort, I'd come to see it as my sanctuary, a place I could retreat to after the daily grind of life. That sanctuary feeling vanished the day I heard my name shouted in an empty room. I can't even articulate the sense of violation I felt in that instant. My name is personal, an intimate label tying me to my identity. Hearing it barked out as though by an unseen intruder triggered every fight or flight instinct in my body. My pulse thundered in my ears and my breath snagged in my throat, leaving me momentarily paralyzed. I stayed like that for a few seconds, chest-tight eyes darting for the source of the voice. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a bizarre auditory hallucination. Maybe I'd been under too much stress, or I was simply exhausted with trembling hands. I inspected every room anyway, each door squeaking as I flung it open, each closet light flickering ominously. No sign of anyone else, no sign that a real intruder had forced entry for a while. I managed to compartmentalize the experience, pushing it into a corner of my mind labeled one-off weirdness. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. This time it sounded different, like a whisper, but still forcibly close, as though someone were leaning right next to my ear. It said my name once, slow and breathy, before fading into silence. I bolted upright, heart-hammering cold sweat trickling along my temples. A gnawing dread settled in my stomach, and I remained awake for hours listening for any sign of movement. Days passed, and the phenomenon escalated. My name reverberated through the house at precise intervals, though I wouldn't notice the pattern until later. It might come from the living room in the morning, from the kitchen after lunch. From the narrow staircase at dusk, the voices varied too, which was even more unsettling. Sometimes deep and resonant, other times shrill and rasping. Each call brought an onslaught of adrenaline, a quiver in my limbs and a dryness in my mouth that felt like sandpaper. I developed a perpetual tension in my shoulders and lower back from being braced for the next sudden shout. I tried to confide in a friend, indirectly mentioning strange noises in my home and suspecting thin walls or odd acoustics. I didn't admit hearing my name. He shrugged it off, attributing it to the house's old construction and my overactive imagination. I wanted to believe that too, but late at night, shrouded in darkness, I couldn't ignore the chill that radiated from the corners of my bedroom. I couldn't pretend my heart wasn't skipping beats every time the voice returned. Eventually, I got the idea to record the occurrences. I placed my phone on a table and hit the audio recorder. Whenever the intervals neared by now, I'd notice the pattern repeating roughly every 6 hours, almost to the minute. Yet every time I played back the recordings, all I heard was silence or a faint static hiss. No trace of the voices at all. I swore I could feel my sanity disintegrating piece by piece. Even without tangible proof, the phenomenon persisted. The consistency was unnerving, as though some hidden intelligence carefully timed each whisper or shout. Unable to rest, I began to track each occurrence meticulously in a notebook. I noted the date, the exact time, the room I was in, the approximate direction the voice seemed to come from, and any distinguishing traits of the call. Within a week, my pages were filled with frenzied scrolls and cramped diagrams, little arrows representing the direction of each incident. It wasn't until I started looking at these maps collectively that I noticed a strange geometric pattern. Each new arrow, each new point aligned with a very specific structure. It reminded me of an architectural blueprint with symmetrical corridors and rectangular spaces. The lines were too deliberate to be a coincidence. My curiosity overshadowed my fear. At least for a while, I headed to the local archives, curious about the history of the land where my house now stood. Digging through old records, I discovered something unsettling. Many decades ago, the grounds had been home to a makeshift detention facility, essentially an early prison of sorts. It was designed with a particular symmetrical layout to maximize security. The building had been demolished, replaced by the cluster of homes that currently occupied the neighborhood. The blueprint in the archive looked eerily similar to the shapes in my notes. A slow crawling sensation tightened around my gut as I studied the prison's old layout. Each corridor, each cell was in the exact same position as the lines I'd drawn to track the voices. Some intangible presence was recreating that structure within my home, using these shouted calls as markers. The unsettling discovery ignited a new wave of anxiety. My palms grew clammy and an electric tension fanned out across my scalp. My rational mind insisted this was impossible, but I had the data to prove otherwise when I tried to show my rough diagrams to my friend. He dismissed it as some coincidence, suggesting I was finding patterns in random static. I nodded numbly, but inside I felt a hollowness expand in my chest. I sensed I was dealing with something far beyond coincidence. The more I researched, the darker the history became. The detention facility was rumored to have housed individuals locked away under the harshest conditions. Their voices, their cries, perhaps that agony had never quite dissipated. Some reports even hinted at a collective presence lingering on the site. Disturbingly, the claims mentioned how that presence needed a focus. Something living to latch onto the stories were unspecific about the final outcomes. But I gleaned enough to understand that this wasn't purely folklore. It felt real, and I was living it back home. I began to sense changes in the physical environment. The house was never warm, but now there seemed to be cold spots in random places, a 10-degree drop in temperature near my sofa, an unnerving chill around the staircase. My limbs developed goosebumps even in the middle of the afternoon. I found myself jumping at every little noise, from the ticking of the kitchen clock to the subtle groan of the attic beams. My appetite dwindled, and my nights were plagued by half-formed nightmares of corridors stretching endlessly, each with a voice calling out my name from within. Then I started feeling pressure in certain rooms, as though I were being crowded by invisible onlookers. It was like standing in a jam-packed elevator, except I was alone. The air felt heavier and my breathing grew tight. I found my chest rising and falling in a labored rhythm, as if something dense and unseen weighed on my body. The sense of being watched grew impossible to dismiss once, while brushing my teeth in the bathroom mirror. I thought I saw a faint silhouette flicker behind me, but it vanished the moment I spun around. Adrenaline blasted through my system, my pulse hammering so fast that my vision flickered with spots of light. Worse yet, the repeated calls were intensifying. No longer did they merely ring out and fade. Now they sometimes lingered, echoing like a drawn-out moan that ended in what could have been a sob or a hiss. When I heard it next to my bed at dawn, so close that I felt hot breath on my ear, I tumbled out of the covers, hitting the floor. My heart pounded as though trying to break free from my chest, and sweat soaked my hairline. The voice had shifted. It sounded like multiple tones layered on top of each other, a disharmony that made the hairs on my arm stand rigid. It repeated my name twice before withdrawing into silence. In my desperation, I decided I needed to figure out precisely where each call originated to mark out a fully realized map of this spectral structure. I spent hours pacing the halls with a watch in one hand and a piece of chalk in the other, drawing X-shaped marks on the walls and floor at every spot. I believed the voice came from every 6 hours it would happen, and I would add another mark. Soon the interior of my home was covered in chalk crosses, lines and frantic notes in my handwriting. A strange labyrinth emerged on my walls, reflecting the exact shape of the old prison's corridors. As the geometry neared completion, the atmosphere in the house began to smother me. The temperature fluctuated drastically. Sometimes an icy wind would gust through the living room, rattling the windows only for the stifling heat to return. Moments later, my breathing grew ragged, my throat dry, and my skin damp with perspiration. My senses started to blur. The faint outlines I caught in my peripheral vision seemed sharper, more defined, as though shapes were stepping forward from the chalk markings. More than once I felt something brush against my shoulder or arm, a feather-like contact that made me jerk away and spin around in terror. Yet still nothing was there, or if it was, I couldn't see it in any solid form. I tried to speak out loud, seldom because direct speech disturbed me, but when I did, my voice sounded thin, uncertain. I remember once demanding to be left alone, but the response was nothing but an oppressive silence. Another time I whispered that I wasn't afraid. Yet the quake in my chest betrayed the lie I believed that whatever was calling me was drawing power from my fear. My confusion, my dread, soared when the next call contained a guttural, multi-layered voice that didn't just speak my name. It dragged the syllables out in a mocking, half-hissing tone in the final phase as the chalk diagram approached what I suspected was the last piece of the puzzle. I started to see flickers of movement in broad daylight. The outlines were gathering, coalescing into shapes that resembled twisted silhouettes, each one contorted in a posture of misery or rage. Panic crept into every muscle of my body. My legs trembled so severely that I had to lean against the wall just to remain standing. My lungs burned from the shallow, frantic way I was breathing. I kept telling myself this couldn't be real, yet my senses refused to give me any reprieve. Every nerve was convinced the presence was tangible, pressing in on me from all sides. On the day the geometry was finally complete, I felt an almost electric sizzle in the air. It was as if the house vibrated with anticipation. A dark film seemed to coat the windows, blocking out the sunlight. The lights inside flickered. No matter which bulb I replaced, shadows moved in corners where no objects existed to cast them. And then I heard a collective voice, a layered chorus reverberating from every direction, entombing me in sound. It stretched my name into something that felt foreign, each letter pulsing with its own sinister life. I fell to my knees, hands clapped over my ears, trying to shield myself from the deafening call. My heart hammered so hard it sent jolts down my arms, and I was gulping for air as if I were drowning. I wanted to scream back, to shout for whatever this was to cease, but my throat locked my vocal cords, refusing to cooperate. In that all-consuming moment, my vision swarmed with pinpoints of darkness. It felt as though something enormous and ancient were surging through the walls, collapsing distances, dragging that historical blueprint into the present. Then, just as my consciousness threatened to slip away, the noise cut off, my ears rang, but the immediate onslaught receded. I crawled to my feet, head spinning, stumbling like a drunk. The once lingering silhouettes had merged into a single patch of darkness in the center of the living room. It shifted and quivered as though hundreds of restless shapes fought for dominance inside it. For a terrifying second, I believed it would take physical form, a monstrous amalgamation of all those tormented presences. Instead, it hovered there, a swirling void that crackled with unseen energy. I wanted to run, my entire body scream for me to flee, yet a compulsion rooted me to the spot, as though this mass of shadows had tethered itself to my name. And thus to me, my chest throbbed and I tasted copper on my tongue. Seconds stretched into an eternity while I stared at this dark vortex, an inverted shape that didn't reflect light but rather swallowed it. In the midst of that dread, a strange clarity blossomed. I realized that my presence had enabled whatever lingering echo of that old prison existed. The calls my name repeated had anchored this collective consciousness here and now. That the blueprint was complete, it was on the brink of fully manifesting. I remembered reading something in the archives about focusing the will, about refusing to give up the mental ground these entities need to hold on, with my legs quivering. I concentrated on every ounce of defiance I had left. My heart pounded at a brutal pace, but I forced myself to think, "You cannot have me, you are not stronger than me." I fought the urge to let fear take over. Slowly, agonizingly, I managed to step back. Another step followed, and another, until I reached the threshold of the room. A low rumble emanated from the center of the living room, the swirling mass contracted, convulsing in place. I felt a pressure on my chest, a sense of invisible hands pushing me toward the center. My eyes watered as I clenched my fists, every hair on my body standing on end. I held on to that tiny seed of resolve, fueling it with each ragged breath. I could practically feel the swirl of shapes testing my defenses, trying to siphon my fear, but I refused to yield my chest. Burned with an unsteady combination of panic and determination without warning, the darkness fractured. A sharp screech ricocheted through the room like every voice that had shouted my name. Now howling in unison, the temperature plummeted. I saw my own breath puff out in white plumes. Then, as quickly as the phenomenon had surged, it relented. The swirling black mass flickered once more, then collapsed in on itself like a dying star. A final drawn-out sigh reverberated in the air, and it was gone. I remained there unmoving until my trembling legs gave way and I sank to the floor. My heart was still racing and sweat plastered my shirt to my back. The chalk lines scrolled across my walls and floor were faintly visible, half erased by the sudden blast of energy that had whipped through the room. My entire body ached as though I had been physically pummeled. The heaviness in the atmosphere had eased, replaced by a throbbing silence. My breathing was uneven, but the pressing sense of doom had lifted. If only marginally. In the hours that followed, I cautiously tested each room, stepping over the chalk markings, searching for any trace of that presence I encountered. Nothing. No frigid spots, no rancid odors, no flickers at the edge of my vision. The repeating voices were absent, yet an unease lingered, digging its claws into the back of my mind. I couldn't tell if I was truly free of that collective consciousness or merely granted a reprieve. My name no longer echoed through the halls, but I found myself listening constantly, heart skipping a beat at every rustle or creak that night. I forced myself to sleep in my own bed, half expecting a hiss in my ear. At any moment when morning finally broke without incident, I felt a cautious relief. Even so, I couldn't look at the chalk outlines on the walls without a surge of nausea and anxiety. Part of me wanted to scrub every mark, every arrow, to purge this place of the geometry that had nearly manifested a nightmare in my living room. Yet another part hesitated, terrified that disturbing the pattern might reignite the phenomenon. In the end, I slowly washed away each chalk line, my hands shaking with each wipe, my breath hitching whenever the old house groaned. I now live amid a fragile truce with whatever remains in these walls. I haven't heard my name called in weeks, and the silhouettes have not reappeared. Still, the hush that hangs over each room feels unnatural, like a held breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale. Sometimes my stomach twists with dread at the thought that the collective consciousness might be biding its time, lurking below my perception. Every so often I'll catch a flicker of movement in a shadow or sense a whisper that vanishes before I can fully register it in those moments. My heart clenches, and the memory of that swirling dark mass floods my chest with raw panic. Perhaps I've sealed away the presence for now, or perhaps I've only taught it caution. I don't know. All I can do is try to maintain my grip on reality, keep my will strong, and resist the allure of fear. Because if there's one thing I learned, it's that this land, my land, is steeped in old torment. Its echoes linger like half-heard cries in the night, reaching out for anyone who will heed them. I pray I never again hear my name in that terrible layered chorus, yet no matter how many candles I burn or how many lights I leave on, the house still feels watchful. I can never fully banish the sense that at any given moment something just behind the walls is trying to recall that old geometry, waiting for me to falter. That uneasy truce is all I have. Now I keep telling myself that I'm still here, still breathing, and that has to count for something still when night falls. I sometimes lie awake listening to the silence in my house, heart pounding at the possibility that the next breath of wind might carry a voice that knows my name too well. Story 6, a cold weight settled in my stomach the moment I stepped out of my car. It felt like the entire forest watched me with a silent and predatory curiosity. A shiver crawled up my spine and my breath caught in my throat before I could even unload my camping gear. Deep inside, I sensed something lurking in the shadows, a presence that made my muscles tighten and my heart pound, as though it wanted to burst from my chest. Every sound became a warning: the crunch of gravel under my boots, the dull echo of a distant crow, and the soft murmur of wind passing through pine needles. The campsite looked peaceful on the surface, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air that made me feel like I'd already crossed a line I couldn't retreat from. I had planned a weekend of solitude, hoping to clear my head from the mounting pressures of everyday life. I pitched my tent beneath a towering oak whose gnarled branches seemed to weave into each other like twisted veins in a giant's arm. By the time I finished setting up, late afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long spidery shadows across the forest floor. The environment was quiet, too quiet. Not the peaceful hush I had hoped for, but a charged silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to brush it off, attributing my anxiety to the stress I had felt in recent weeks. But as dusk approached, the unease intensified. My heartbeats were shallow thuds, each pulse echoing in my ears. My throat felt tight, and I caught myself swallowing hard, trying to moisten a tongue gone bone dry without realizing it. I began to glance around anxiously, searching for a threat I couldn't define. When I finally noticed what was happening, I realized I was drenched in cold sweat. My shirt clung to my back, and a chill crept along my arms. Despite the mild temperature, something about this place, or something within me, was wrong. That first night I barely slept. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes flicking back and forth in the darkness, haunted by shapes that disappeared the moment I tried to focus. Each rustle of leaves beyond my tent made my pulse race. My breath turned shallow. I kept thinking I saw a figure in the corner of my vision, or sensed a hand brushing against the fabric. I whispered to myself that it was only the wind, but deep down I knew that was a lie. Morning should have brought relief, but it didn't. With the early sunlight came an even deeper tension. I remember standing at the edge of a small lake, trying to force myself to enjoy the scenery. The surface was smooth, reflecting the pale sky with a mirror-like sheen. Despite the apparent tranquility, my stomach churned. It wasn't just anxiety anymore. It felt like my body was responding to a genuine threat. My skin prickled with goosebumps that wouldn't fade, and my mind whirled with nameless fears. That's when I first saw it, or sensed it. A dark mist floated at the periphery of my vision. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just tall pines standing still as sentinels. Yet whenever I looked away, I felt its presence again. It was like a smudge on my sight that only revealed itself indirectly. My heart pounded even harder. I felt my chest tighten with panic, and a wave of nausea rushed through me as I tried to blink away the phantom darkness. The idea of losing my sanity gripped me, and I wondered if maybe I was having some sort of breakdown, determined to confront whatever was happening. I pushed my fear aside and went back to my tent all day. That inky shadow lingered in the corner of my vision, pulsing with an energy that wrapped cold tendrils around my mind. By sunset, I was shaking so badly I could hardly build a fire. My hands trembled as if I'd been locked in a freezer for hours. When I finally lit the flames, I sat there numb and overwhelmed, watching the night sky grow darker and darker. That was when I realized my senses had sharpened in a profoundly unsettling way. I could pick up on the emotional states of animals scurrying in the undergrowth. Their tiny heartbeats and flickers of fear and curiosity floated around me like glowing motes I could sense as shapes or pulses in the air. My breath caught in my chest as I realized it wasn't normal to see emotions like this. Then I recalled the dark mist that haunted my vision. Maybe that was a manifestation of my own terror, or maybe it was something else entirely, something outside of me. By the time the sky was fully black, I had the distinct impression that the darkness wasn't just around me, it was within me, linking me to this alien presence. I couldn't explain. I could almost hear a sickly hum or vibration behind my ears, as if something was tuning into my fear frequency. My legs grew weak, and I dropped to my knees beside the fire. I felt drenched in cold sweat again, my heart battering my ribcage with ferocity. Every exhale seemed to carry a whimper of dread. I can't recall how I made it through the night without sprinting into the woods. In blind panic, the next morning I broke camp and left, convinced that I was escaping a nightmare. The drive home felt endless. My entire body remained tense, and my eyes kept darting to the edges of the road, worried I'd see that dark smudge drifting among the trees. Once I reached my driveway, relief flooded me. I was back in a familiar environment, far from that cursed campsite, but comfort never arrived. Soon after my return, I started sensing more emotional auras around people. If someone nearby was anxious, I'd see it as a pulsating gray glow. If someone was angry, a deep red flicker danced like embers on a breeze. The strangest part was that I also felt a link to them, an awareness so profound it left me shaky and unsettled. It was as if my own fear had opened a door that I couldn't close. Then I saw that same dark mist drifting down my hallway. Late at night, the shape was no longer relegated to peripheral vision. It glided, with a slow, predatory grace curling in on itself as though feeding on the air. My heart pounded so violently that my chest ached. My limbs felt heavy and useless, as though I were caught in a tar pit. That night I barely slept again, and each time I managed to close my eyes, I jolted awake in cold sweat. Over the following days, I watched in growing horror as people around me started exhibiting extreme phobias. My neighbor, who had always been fearless about the dark, now refused to switch off his porch light. Another friend repeatedly expressed a paralyzing dread of open windows. Barricading them at night, they had never shown these fears before. It struck me that the same terror that plagued me had begun leaking into others, spreading like a virus. I could perceive the intangible threads connecting us, a kind of psychic fungal network that thrived on dread. I spotted it in the subtle changes of posture, the new lines etched into foreheads, the wide, haunted eyes that refused to meet mine. I came to understand that the dark mist was more than a hallucination. It was an entity, a parasitic being that fed on human fear. It had tasted my terror at the campsite, and now it followed me, using me like a carrier to infect those around me. Each new host displayed a sudden surge of irrational phobias, as if their primal fear centers were plugged into some invisible pipeline. When they were near me, I saw faint tendrils of black root-like projections spreading from my body to theirs. These threads were intangible, yet I sensed them with every fiber of my being, trying to isolate myself. Seemed the only logical solution. I stopped going to gatherings, avoided eye contact, and held up in my apartment for days. My phone vibrated constantly with messages, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I feared that even through technology, this thing might creep into someone else's mind. My heart raced whenever I thought about the prospect that more people would suffer the same soul-crushing terror. I felt the dryness in my mouth grew constant, and my palms perpetually dripped with sweat. My hands trembled so badly that simple tasks like cooking or typing took double the effort. At night, the mist coiled in the corners of my home. It slithered along the baseboards, creeping closer as if savoring the mounting fear that radiated off me one evening while trying desperately to distract myself by watching a movie. I caught sight of the black tendrils stretching across the ceiling. My entire body seized with panic. My heartbeat hammered against my eardrums, and I gasped for breath like a drowning swimmer. The edges of my vision blurred. I nearly fainted. Cold sweat drenching my forehead. Somehow I forced myself to focus on steady breathing until the wave of dread abated, but the relief was always short-lived. The parasitic entity was never far. I began to sense the spread more acutely around my building. I overheard someone in the hallway mentioning that another resident had developed a sudden panic of flushing toilets. Of all things, a friend texted me recounting a vivid nightmare about being trapped in an elevator. Even though they'd never had claustrophobia before, their messages were laced with terrified confusion, and the guilt in my chest grew heavier by the hour. I tried to investigate my predicament by researching obscure psychological conditions and paranormal phenomena. My vision blurred after hours of scrolling through forums and unreadable articles. I found an old reference to a concept describing fear as an energy that certain entities consume. It was described as an emotional mechanism, a hidden fungal network that linked one terrified mind to another, allowing the parasite to feed on mass. My eyes stung with sleeplessness, and my heart pounded with each new piece of information. My breath came out in uneven, ragged bursts. I felt no closer to a solution, only more aware that I was trapped in something massive and horrifying. One night, I could bear it no longer. I decided to confront the thing directly. My plan was half-formed and desperate. If I could somehow separate my emotions from the creature's feeding channels, maybe I could starve it. I turned off all the lights in my apartment and forced myself to remain calm, picturing my fear as a tangible resource. I could withhold the darkness. Was absolute almost immediately. I felt its presence swarm around me as if excited by my vulnerability. My pulse raced, but I tried to suppress my panic, breathing deliberately to keep my heart rate from spiraling. I stood in the center of my living room, every muscle clenched, my teeth chattered with raw terror. My palms were slick and my shirt stuck to my torso. But somehow in that moment I visualized a barrier around my thoughts. When I felt the dark tendrils slither against my psyche, I imagined them hitting a solid wall and recoiling sweat poured down my temples, and my vision flickered with faint spots of color. Yet I continued to push the terror away, refusing to let it grow. Gradually, the sense of suffocation eased, the air around me felt lighter. I opened my eyes. I saw the mist retreat, shrinking into a corner of the room as if I had become distasteful to it. My body trembled like a leaf in a storm, and the exertion left me dizzy. For the first time since the camping trip, I felt an ounce of power over my circumstances. Though the creature didn't vanish entirely, I sensed a subtle shift in its strength, as if some vital cord had been cut over the next days. I learned to repeat that meditative state, denying the parasite the feast it desired. I could still feel it hovering at the edges of my awareness, waiting for me to slip back into despair and panic. But I held on, cultivating a cold, focused calm whenever I felt the beginnings of fear rising in my chest. Friends reported less frequent bouts of irrational phobias, and the oppressive tension in my surroundings eased, though it never fully disappeared. I realized that my connection to the entity remained an unwelcome tether that could tighten at any moment. Part of me knew it was biding its time, content to lurk until I weakened, or someone else nearby took in enough terror to feed it again. Even so, I managed to return to a semblance of normal life. I left my apartment more often, slowly regained some sense of control, but that final revelation that this thing was out there thriving on our darkest dreads never left me. Sometimes late at night, I still catch a glimpse of that dark mist drifting by a window or curling under a door. My heart will stutter, my breath will catch, and I'll feel droplets of cold sweat beating on my forehead. Yet I've learned to push it away, keeping my fear on a tight leash. I've accepted that my life will never be the same. There is a parasite feeding on terror, an invisible mycelium, connecting us through our shared vulnerabilities. It followed me home from the woods, built a network of fear, and tried to devour every ounce of security. I once knew I might have gained a fragile control, but the real horror is the knowledge that it can't be destroyed. Only contained. Every time I close my eyes, I brace myself against the possibility that I'll open them to find it looming before me, drifting in the darkness, hungry, and that knowledge more than anything ensures I'll never truly rest again. Story 7, I felt an odd unease the first time I stepped into that apartment. I remember how the hallway light seemed to flicker right as I turned the key in the lock, and the heaviness in the air made my chest feel tight. Something about the place just seemed wrong, but I had brushed it off as nerves about moving. Now looking back, I realized that unsettling sensation wasn't just a trick of my imagination, it was a warning, and I ignored it. I moved to this building, an old structure that supposedly had been remodeled many times because the rent was cheap and the location convenient. It had a grand facade with gargoyles perched along the roof, rained walls, and tall, narrow windows that let in little light. People in the neighborhood had told me the building was known for having a complicated history, but they never gave me details. My first few nights were nothing unusual, though they felt strangely quiet, as if the floors and walls were holding their breath. I told myself I was just acclimating to a new environment, yet a sense of unease settled in my bones, making me restless. I could hear the old pipes groan in the distance sometimes, as if something alive was traveling through them, when I finally decided to take a long hot shower to release the tension in my muscles. I discovered the first sign that my new home was a place of secrets. The moment I turned on the shower, my ears picked up an unsettling murmur. At first I thought I was imagining it, just the sound of water hitting the tiles, but as I rinsed the shampoo out of my hair, the murmuring turned into distinct whispers. My heart hammered against my rib cage and my pulse fluttered in my neck. I remember standing there, soap in my eyes, unsure if I was actually hearing voices. A wave of nausea rolled through me and I nearly slipped on the wet tiles. I clenched my teeth, my breath coming in ragged bursts. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was like a crowd of people speaking just below the surface of the water, pressing their voices through the rushing torrent. Every hair on my body prickled and I fumbled to shut off the faucet, but the voices continued for a few seconds, even after the water stopped, then abruptly went silent. I pressed my ear against the tiled wall, my wet skin leaving a cold imprint, but I heard nothing. My heart still drummed and my breaths came short and sharp as I tried to collect myself the next few days. I tried to rationalize what I had experienced. Maybe the pipes were old and produced strange echoes. Perhaps the water pressure changes created a whistling that mimicked speech. I told myself that new surroundings often play tricks on a stressed mind, but as soon as I turned the shower back on, the faint whispering returned, always just at the edge of my hearing. The voices seemed to rise and fall with the flow of water as if they were feeding off it. They whispered words I couldn't make out, but I felt a piercing dread. Each time they spoke, the water started to carry more than just heat and moisture into the air. It carried a presence on the fifth day. I called a friend of mine and described in halting sentences what I had been experiencing. He offered the usual reassurances that maybe it was just the building's ancient plumbing. He suggested I play loud music while showering to mask the sound. I tried that, but it made no difference through the blare of music. I could still discern those insidious whispers, faint but insistent. My friend could tell I was shaken, even though I tried to sound casual, and he recommended I talk to the building superintendent. I went to the superintendent's office, a cramped space in the basement. I explained that I heard odd sounds in the water pipes, almost like voices. He looked at me with an inscrutable expression, then said maybe the pipes were clogged and that he'd send someone to check. I left feeling uneasy. Something in his eyes hinted that he knew more than he was letting on. The entire conversation felt like an evasion. That same evening, I noticed another strange phenomenon. The water in my kitchen sink trickled out at an odd angle, as if defying gravity. For a split second, I turned the faucet on and off, baffled by the droplets that seemed to hover midair before plummeting into the basin. My hand shook as I reached into the stream, and a biting cold surged through my fingertips. The temperature shouldn't have been so low if I'd set it to warm, yet the water felt unnaturally frigid, leaving behind a tingling sensation like static electricity. Within a week, the activity escalated. Taking a shower became more than just an auditory nightmare. The water itself started forming swirling, spiraling patterns on the bathtub floor as if guided by an unseen hand. My skin would prickle and my stomach knotted with each swirl, as if I were inches away from a terrible secret. I began to keep the lights on everywhere in the apartment. Even though I knew it wouldn't stop the phenomenon, it was a flimsy shield against the dread crawling through my thoughts. Nighttime brought new horrors. I often woke up drenched in sweat, uncertain if the sounds I heard were real soft scraping noises, as if nails were tapping along the pipes inside the walls, followed by an almost melodic gurgle of water. On one particularly disturbed night, I left my bedroom to get a drink of water, only to find the faucet turned on by itself. The water shot from the tap in a thin pointed stream and curved upward before splashing against the steel basin. I swear it was defying physics right in front of me. My throat constricted, my breath ragged as if I couldn't pull enough oxygen into my lungs. When I finally mustered the courage to twist the knob, the water shut off, leaving me to stare at the drip, drip, drip echoing ominously in the sink. The following morning, I was brushing my teeth when I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. The shower curtain behind me was closed, but I noticed a dark, shifting silhouette. I turned around slowly, sweat breaking out along my forehead, heart thundering in my chest. The shower curtain fluttered slightly as if disturbed by a gust of wind, yet the bathroom window was sealed shut. Summoning all my nerve, I yanked the curtain open. The tub was empty, but the surface of the water droplets around the drain seemed to quake like it was trembling with a life of its own. Suddenly, I felt an intense chill that worked its way up my spine, and I bolted from the room. By this point, my sense of reality started to fray every time I heard the old pipes groan. I expected to hear those voices seep in. I could almost discern words. Sometimes pleas for help or accusations, my neck muscles were constantly tense, my palms clammy. I was exhausted, but too afraid to sleep deeply. The fear of letting my guard down haunted me. My mind circled back to questions I couldn't answer. Why did the water behave so strangely? Who did those voices belong to? And what if I was simply losing my mind? Then I began to research the history of the building. Combing through local archives, I discovered that this was once the site of an old estate rumor. Had it, the original owner was obsessed with the idea of reaching a parallel world he believed lay just beyond the water's surface. Some stories suggested he had used the house's water system to conduct bizarre experiments, but the accounts were vague. Nobody mentioned children or families, just rumors of tenants disappearing, though. No conclusive record showed any official missing persons cases. Still, I felt a profound sense of unease reading about it. The more I dug, the more I uncovered a pattern of abrupt vacancies over the decades, always involving the top floors where my apartment now stood, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. I confronted the superintendent again. This time I demanded an explanation for the strange occurrences. He just stared at me, his eyes flickering with what looked like guilt. After a lengthy pause, he admitted in hushed tones, with his gaze averted, that the building had a peculiar connection to what he called an aquatic portal. He never explained the origin of that phrase, only that the pipe sometimes acted as a bridge between this plane and another, a watery dimension where lost souls were said to be trapped. He claimed it was all legend, but his trembling voice betrayed him over the following days. The water in my apartment exhibited even more bizarre traits at times. It flowed upward from the sink, forming swirling coils in midair before dropping in the shower. It solidified momentarily into partial shapes, misshapen arms or half-formed faces that vanished the instant I blinked. My heart pounded so fiercely at these sightings that I often staggered out of the bathroom, gasping. My entire body would tremble, sweat pouring down my temples as if I had narrowly escaped some predatory force. Every night I felt as if dozens of eyes were fixed on me through the walls. Once, as I passed by the bathroom in the dim corridor light, I glimpsed a tall, watery silhouette standing behind the shower curtain. Swaying with fluid grace, it dissolved when I mustered the courage to turn on the light, but a lingering dampness remained on the floor, forming swirling patterns around my feet that receded too quickly into the drain. My sense of panic escalated daily, and I could barely focus on work, or even basic chores. Eating felt impossible. My throat was constantly tight, and any attempt at a full meal was met with nausea. One evening, I dared to turn on the shower with the intention of confronting whatever lurked within the second. The water began to rush, the voices erupted, filling the bathroom with a low chorus of moans, whispers, and frantic pleas. Their tone wavered between desperation and rage. I felt my breathing turn shallow, my heart thudding so violently it hurt. My vision blurred as steam rose thick and suffocating, transforming the small space into a haze of humid dread. I could sense shapes moving in the corner of my vision, formed by the steam itself, ghostly forms with fluid edges. My stomach churned, and I clutched the sink to steady myself. In that moment, I understood they were not just random spirits, they were ex-residents trapped in a liminal space caught between worlds. Their presence was strongest in the shower, a direct conduit to the watery dimension. I remembered the old stories about experiments in this house, about portals and lost tenants. Fear twisted in my gut like a knife, and I felt an overwhelming urge to get out, yet I couldn't move. I heard them not as clear voices, but as a collective pulse in my mind. They demanded release, or at least recognition. Suddenly, the water surged upward from the drain, lapping against my ankles, climbing in defiance of gravity. My teeth chattered as frigid water engulfed my legs. The shapes in the steam drifted closer, and I felt like I was being drawn in, my breath caught, and a dizziness overtook me as the water clung to my skin. In that delirious haze, I had a flash of clarity. Maybe I could turn off the main valve in the apartment. If there was no water, no portal would remain. Summoning every scrap of willpower, I lunged for the handle and wrenched the shower off. The water receded instantly, and the bathroom was plunged into a tense silence save for the rapid pounding of my heartbeat. My limbs trembled as I managed to shut off the main water supply. I spent the rest of the night sitting against the bathroom door, forcing myself not to turn the water back on, listening to the building's ancient pipes gurgle and hiss. In protest the next day, I called a professional plumber, but when he arrived, he just gave me a skeptical look. Still, he replaced a few pipes and insisted everything was working. Yet the water remained shut off, and I resisted the urge to test it by the second day with no water. I realized I needed a permanent solution, or I'd be forced to leave the apartment entirely. The tension in the air felt almost alive, as if the building resented my defiance. At times I heard faint moans from the pipes like they were hungry. Desperation fueled my resolve. I barricaded the drains in every sink in the tub with heavy towels and plastic sheeting. Then I went downstairs and explained to the superintendent that I would be moving out. If this wasn't resolved, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and resignation. Quietly, he disclosed a final detail. The building was constructed on top of what some old records called a water gate, an ancient aquatic portal to those who listened too closely or turned on the taps too often. This gateway would reveal itself. Though terror squeezed my stomach, I demanded that he help me seal whatever opening existed. His answer was a vague set of directions involving blocking certain pipes in the basement at midnight, a procedure that sounded like more folklore than fact, but I tried it anyway. Creeping through the damp, poorly lit basement with tools in hand, my skin crawled with every drop of condensation trickling from overhead pipes. The place smelled of mildew and the gloom felt suffocating, but a new determination had replaced some of my fear. Following the instructions, I found several old valves connected to a series of thick, corroded pipes. I turned them shut, twisting until my hands ached the clang of metal, reverberated through the basement corridors, sending echoes that felt almost like screams. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst, and sweat trickled down my temples. Despite the cold air, at the moment I sealed the last valve, a massive rush of water roared within the pipe as if something on the other side was fighting back. My breath caught in my throat. Then the noise subsided, and an oppressive silence replaced it. My arms trembled, but I held firm when I climbed back up to my apartment. The atmosphere felt lighter, as if a dense fog had lifted over the next hour. I tested the water it trickled from the faucet as a normal stream with no unusual behavior. My relief was so great that my knees buckled and I sank onto the floor chest, heaving with long, shaky breaths. My entire body quivered, drained from weeks of relentless fear, but I felt like I had severed a malignant link. I stayed in the apartment another 2 days, too shaken to trust that the threat was truly gone, yet not once did I hear the voices. The water remained obedient to gravity. There were no shapes in the steam, no bizarre humming in the walls. The building itself felt different, less hostile. Eventually, I made the decision to leave. Though the phenomena had ceased, I couldn't stomach the idea of living in a place perched on the edge of a dimension where lost souls lingered. As I locked up, for the last time I heard a faint dripping from the bathroom. I froze, my heart lurching. A dread-laced prickle crawled up my spine. Stepping inside, I noticed the faucet was dripping one solitary drop at a time. It echoed loudly in the quiet. I turned the knob to tighten it, and the drip stopped for a moment. I thought I heard the distant murmur of voices, but it was so faint it could have been my imagination. My chest felt tight, and I exhaled a shaky breath. Gathering my final belongings, I left the apartment with an unsettling certainty I might have managed to close the door to that watery realm. But the building remained perched over that ancient gateway, and its thirst for new victims might never be fully sated outside under the pale morning light. I felt an odd mixture of relief and lingering terror. I told myself I was safe, that I had overcome something impossible, but the faint sound of dripping water in the back of my mind continues to haunt me, reminding me that some doors once discovered can never be entirely locked. I've stayed away from that building, yet Even now, whenever I step into a shower or hear water running through pipes, my skin prickles, my heart races, and my mouth goes dry. My mind replays every horrifying detail, every swollen droplet that rose against gravity, every ghostly shape that hovered behind the shower curtain. Sometimes in my deepest moments of doubt, I wonder if I did indeed seal that portal, or if it simply besides its time waiting for someone less wary to open the taps. And that thought lingers like a cold hand on my shoulder, reminding me that some horrors are too vast to truly escape Story 8. I remember the first time I felt something watching me, even before I saw the horned figure dancing in the shadows. It was a suffocating heaviness in the air, an almost physical pressure that made it difficult to swallow, as though an invisible pair of hands were tightening around my throat. My pulse pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, and every muscle in my body braced for a threat that had no name. I stood there in my dimly lit studio paintbrush in hand, staring at a blank canvas. Convinced I was not alone, the feeling was unsettling but diffuse, like hearing a whisper in a language you don't understand. It was a fleeting moment, but it stained my thoughts long after I left the easel that was the beginning of my descent into the most disorienting chapter of my life. My studio is a single room loft with a high ceiling and tall windows that let in the city's sickly orange glow. At night, each corner is cluttered with half-finished canvases, paint-stained rags, and sculptures. In various stages of completion, the overhead fluorescent lights flicker sporadically, creating staccato bursts of brightness that make me feel as if I'm under interrogation when the flicker coincides with complete silence. It's as if the world briefly halts and I'm stranded alone in a moment, outside of time. A week after that initial sense of being watched, I was working late. Bent over a new canvas, my only illumination came from a single desk lamp casting harsh shadows across my workspace. My back ached from hunching over the easel, but inspiration had struck, and I refused to let the moment slip away. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. It was not the usual flicker of my faulty overhead light. It was something more organic, something with shape and substance. I looked up and saw near a stack of old canvases leaning against the wall, a silhouette about the size of a cat. It was darker than the surrounding gloom, like a concentration of blackness that made the rest of the shadows seem pale. In comparison, the shape had horns, two curved protrusions that caught the faint glow of the lamp, and it seemed to pulse like living smoke. A wave of cold air passed through me, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. My lungs seized, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. My heart kicked into a staccato rhythm, adrenaline surging through my veins by the time I managed to blink. The figure was gone, yet the impression it left on my retinas lingered like a photographic afterimage. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a side effect of fatigue and too much coffee. But the cold feeling in my chest, the clammy sweat coating my palms, told me something was wrong. The stirring in my gut whispered that I had brushed up against something profoundly unsettling, something that had no place in my familiar paint-splattered world. Over the following days, I saw it again, always at the edges of my vision, always half buried in the shadows. It moved silently with a fluidity that reminded me of smoke, carried by a gentle draft. My paintbrush would slip from my fingers, or I would lose my train of thought whenever it appeared. At first, I tried to dismiss it as stress-induced hallucinations, but the persistent sense of a presence wouldn't let me rest. It was in the subtle changes in the atmosphere of the studio. The air tasted metallic. My ears picked up faint scuttling sounds when I was certain I was alone, and the overhead fluorescents would buzz in an odd syncopated rhythm like they were flickering in time with some hidden heartbeat. I started painting to exercise my anxieties, hoping that by pouring them onto the canvas I could reclaim my sanity. I created abstract shapes and dark colors, swirling them together to form chaotic patterns. I found a certain catharsis in those aggressive brushstrokes, each slash of color an attempt to purge that eerie presence from my thoughts. Yet something in the final product began to unsettle me. Hidden in the patterns and textures, I noticed shapes that resembled that horned creature. I would step back to admire my progress, only to spot a faint silhouette curling within the paint, where my original intent had been purely expressionistic. These unsettling forms felt inserted by an external hand. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was simply projecting my paranoia onto the canvas, but friends who visited my studio mentioned that the new paintings felt disquing, as if something in the pigments disturbed them on a subconscious level. One patron who commissioned a piece later contacted me to say that the artwork made them uneasy. They described recurring nightmares that started the night they brought the canvas home in these dreams. They saw an inky figure lurking in dark corners waiting for them to fall asleep. They thought it was a coincidence, but their voice trembled when they shared the story, and they insisted they had never experienced dreams like that before. Little by little, more clients reported similar experiences. Some refused to come out and say it directly, but they hinted that something about my creations had begun to affect them in unsettling ways. They spoke of hearing strange noises in the room where the artwork was displayed. They reported a creeping sense of being watched and fleeting glimpses of a shape that vanished the instant they tried to focus on it. One particularly skittish client left a frantic message telling me they had woken to find the painting slightly askew on the wall, although they lived alone and rarely had visitors according to them. The background colors of the painting seemed to shift each time they blinked when they tried to remove it from their home. An inexplicable fear seized them and they found themselves too terrified to touch it. As though the piece exuded a repulsive aura, listening to these accounts made my heart pound relentlessly against my ribs. I felt trapped between fear and curiosity. I began to see patterns in my nightmares that echoed the stories I was hearing. The horned silhouette in the periphery, the sense of something intangible creeping closer. My anxiety manifested in physical symptoms. My hands trembled as I picked up a brush. Sweat gathered cold and slick under my arms, and my pulse was in a constant race with my imagination. Day after day, the boundary between my art and my reality blurred further. It was like the entity was using my creativity as a conduit, slipping into each piece without my conscious approval. During one particularly oppressive night, I sat in my studio, lights dimmed, trying to work on a new project. A rancid smell wafted through the room, sour and moldy, and it struck me so strongly that I gagged, my eyes watered, and I glanced around to see if maybe a piece of fruit had rotted or a damp rag had been left in a corner as I rose to check. I spotted the figure again, this time more distinct than ever. Its body coiled like twisting smoke, but its horn seemed solid. Protruding from its small, hunched form, it advanced a fraction of an inch, and I felt a sudden chill embrace me. My breath caught in my throat, and I broke into a clammy sweat. The figure stared at me, though it had no visible eyes. I felt its scrutiny as clearly as a hot brand. I tried to speak, but my mouth was so dry, my tongue felt like sandpaper. The only sound that emerged was a trembling exhalation. Then, in a fluid, impossible motion, it swirled around the base of my canvas. I watched in horrified fascination as wisps of black mist seemed to meld with the wet paint, forming a subtle, near-invisible mark on the surface. The second it merged with the painting, the rancid smell vanished, replaced by the faint odor of ozone, as though lightning had just struck inside the studio. I practically tore the canvas from the easel and hid it behind a stack of older works, hoping out of sight would mean out of mind, but the memory lingered. My mind reeled with questions. Had I gone mad? Was I hallucinating? Or was there something ancient and malevolent weaving itself into my art? Over the next weeks, I researched esoteric art histories and obscure mythologies. I found references to ancient cultures that believed spirits could inhabit objects, idols, sculptures, paintings, turning them into gateways for hidden deities to exert influence over the mortal realm. One text mentioned a particularly obscure sect devoted to an entity sometimes depicted with small horns and a smoky form said to thrive on creative energy. The more I read, the deeper the chill in my bones grew. My pulse rate seemed permanently elevated, and I felt a constant flutter in my stomach, as if I were teetering on the brink of a revelation I wasn't prepared to handle. I recalled the messages from my patrons, the shared nightmares and common visions. It wasn't just me. This entity or deity or whatever it was broadcasting its presence through my pieces, influencing anyone who acquired them. Every sale, every client who proudly displayed my work unwittingly invited this thing into their homes. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I doubled over, gasping for air sweat beating on my forehead. My eyes burned with unshed tears of dread and guilt. Had I become a vessel for something far beyond my understanding, I tried to stop painting, but it was as if an unearthly compulsion overtook me. My hands twitched with the need to apply paint and fluid motions to bring shape to the swirling images in my mind. Each time I gave in, the horned figure would appear again at the edges of my vision, nudging me to include its likeness in my work in increasingly subtle ways. Sometimes it was a faint curve in the background, other times a swirl of dark shadow that almost formed a silhouette. My nails bit into my palms as I wrestled with the compulsion, but it was no use. The entity's influence was potent and all-consuming when I attempted to speak with a confidant, an old acquaintance who once studied the occult. He told me indirectly that I needed to destroy the pieces. He didn't come right out and say it, but his manner was urgent. His voice quivered as he described the dangers of idolatry and the risk of attracting attention from predatory spirits. He asked if I'd felt changes in my physical environment, like sudden drops in temperature or strange electrical surges. I confirmed everything, and that stoked his fear. He implied that the only way to stop the entity's spread was to sever its link to our world by eradicating its mediums, in this case, my artworks. But the more he spoke, the more I felt a clamp tighten around my heart. The idea of destroying what I had created felt both horrifying and impossible. I made an attempt one night, steeling myself to tear down my canvases and throw them into a metal bin. I kept for scraps, my hands shook violently, and the sense of dread was so palpable I could barely breathe. I felt that if I took one step closer to the painting, something in the atmosphere would snap as I reached for the canvas. I heard a scraping sound as if claws were dragging across the concrete floor. My vision blurred and my stomach churned. I dropped to my knees, consumed by raw, choking fear. It felt as though the space around me distorted, pressing in on my chest, so I couldn't inhale without wheezing. In that moment, I became convinced the entity would do more than just prevent me from destroying the piece. It would consume every ounce of my sanity if I tried. Eventually, I abandoned that approach and slumped onto the floor, panting and soaked in cold sweat. My heart pounded like a war drum, and all I could do was stare blankly at the painting that seemed to gaze back at me. I wondered if there was any way to free myself from this predicament. I thought perhaps I could move away, distance myself from the studio, from my work, from all of it. But the art was already scattered. People had purchased pieces that now hung in homes, offices, and galleries. The influence was beyond my reach. Desperation led me to yet another approach, confronting the creature. Directly, I stayed up several nights in a row, refusing to sleep, hoping that if it appeared, I could somehow will it away. The exhaustion was maddening. My head-pounded temples throbbing with every beat of my heart. My eyes were so dry they stung, and my vision danced with dots of light. The entire loft felt like it was closing in, the walls pressed nearer, and the ceiling loomed overhead as if waiting to crush me. Each time I spotted the inky silhouette, my spine would tingle, and a wave of nausea would roll through my stomach. My body was a constant loop of adrenaline spikes and crashing fatigue. Then, in one final burst of clarity, I realized I didn't have to destroy the paintings. I only had to break their resonance, so I prepared a set of thick black drapes and spent the better part of a day covering my finished works. I sealed them away from any human gaze, including my own, hoping this would starve the entity of attention. The process was harrowing. Every time I approached a canvas to drape it, the temperature seemed to drop, and I tasted the metallic tang of fear on my tongue. My fingers trembled so severely I nearly ripped the cloth, but I forced myself to continue, sweat pouring down my face and stinging my eyes. I was certain I heard that scraping noise again, but I drowned it out by focusing on the rustle of fabric. Eventually, each painting and sculpture lay hidden behind layers of thick cloth. Afterward, the atmosphere in the loft felt still and stale. It wasn't exactly peaceful, more like a reluctant truce. My heart still hammered whenever I looked around, half expecting to see the horned figure drifting through the room. I remained vigilant for days, hardly sleeping, my nerves on high alert. I listened for any sound out of place, a creak in the floorboards, a scratch against the window, and sometimes I felt a presence, but it never fully materialized. It was as if the figure had been muted, forced to retreat to the corners of my subconscious. Clients continued to contact me about their experiences, but I distanced myself from them. I politely refused new commissions and explained I was on indefinite hiatus. In truth, I was petrified that creating anything at all might allow the entity to resurface with renewed strength. I blocked out my creative impulses. Deliberately turning my back on the easel each day, I wrestled with the withdrawal symptoms of an artist denied his medium. My hands grew jittery and my mind felt unsettled without that familiar release. Yet beneath that discomfort, I noticed fewer flickers of movement in the shadows. The oppressive weight in the air lifted just enough to grant me shallow moments of ease. Finally, after weeks of self-imposed isolation, I decided to leave the studio. I packed a bag with only the essentials, leaving behind the shrouded pieces that I couldn't bring myself to destroy. The idea of discarding them completely still filled me with dread, as if the entity would punish me the moment I tried. So I locked the door, turned in the key to the building manager, and fled to an apartment across town in my new place. I keep the lights bright and the windows open, letting sunlight flood every corner. Some nights I still wake up drenched in sweat, my heart battering my ribcage as if trying to escape. My mind replays the scuttling noises and the swirling darkness, convinced it might return at any moment. My throat goes dry and I strain my ears to detect even the faintest sign of that hateful presence, but so far it hasn't shown itself. I can't say I feel truly safe somehow. I sense it's still out there, lingering in those covered canvases, in the nightmares of my patrons who refuse to discard their purchases, or in the intangible ether of creativity itself, each piece sold or displayed as a silent herald of that ancient force, whispering invitations to the unsuspecting. I live now in a state of uneasy vigilance, caught between guilt and relief. I wonder if one day I'll find myself drawn back to a paintbrush, compelled by a need stronger than my fear. Will that horned figure reappear at the fringes of my vision, waiting to guide my hand and expand its dominion? The question gnaws at me, and although I manage to keep it at bay most of the time, there are nights when I stand by the window and sense an intelligence searching for me across the cityscape. In those moments, my heart races and goosebumps prickle my skin. The air becomes stifling, and I realize I may never truly be free. I suspect the entity remains dormant only as long as I resist my creative urges, and that knowledge casts a constant shadow over my days. Even now, I feel a subtle compulsion, a faint buzzing in my fingertips, urging me to pick up a pencil to sketch, to channel some hidden image that thrums just beneath my consciousness. I know what waits for me if I give in the horns, the smoke, and the creeping infestation of nightmares that spread like a silent epidemic through anyone who sets eyes on my creations. For now, I stand on a precarious edge. I have no neat resolution, no tidy conclusion. I haven't triumphed over the entity or proven its existence to anyone else. I simply maintain a fragile equilibrium, a quiet life with no painting, no sculpting, no fresh canvases. But sometimes in the hush of early morning, I hear a soft rasping breath in the corner of my room, and I clench my fists until my nails dig into my palms. My pulse quickens and the taste of adrenaline floods my mouth. Even when I switch on every lamp, I catch myself glancing toward the corners, wondering if a small horn shape with smoke for skin is waiting for me to make one wrong move. And in that darkness, I feel the weight of its gaze, a silent pledge that our story is far from over. Story 9, the moment I stepped into that house, my skin prickled with an unnameable dread. Even before I noticed anything out of the ordinary, the wall seemed to exhale a stale breath that made the hair on my arms stand on end. There was a heaviness clinging to every corner, a weight that pressed on my chest. Whenever I tried to draw a full breath at night, it felt as though something was stirring beneath the floorboards, a presence perhaps that wasn't there. Just a moment ago, it was subtle at first, a low thrum at the edge of my hearing, but I could sense it growing stronger by the day, humming with an eerie anticipation. That's how it all began. A faint vibration in the silence, a disquing hush in the dark, and a deep certainty that I was not alone. I initially dismissed my unease as mere imagination. I had moved in a few months prior, eager to settle into a place large enough for me and my two dogs. Moose and Ginger, the house was older than most. On the block, the kind of property that had seen decades of quiet life. Wide windows, a long hallway, a basement. I swore I would never go into for no particular reason other than my own discomfort. It was spacious enough that my footsteps often echoed, and I chalked up the muffled nighttime noises to shifting pipes, old wooden beams, or even the dogs padding around in the darkness. But almost immediately, little peculiarities began to happen. Early one morning, I heard a squeak in the living room, a tiny abrupt yelp. I rushed out of bed to check on the dogs, certain one of them had gotten hurt, but Moose and Ginger were both asleep on their dog beds, breathing softly. My heart pounded so loud I could barely think, and I stood there staring at them, willing my pulse to settle the chill in the air pressed against the back of my neck. My mouth went dry, I could feel sweat beating at my temples. Despite the cold, something about that small noise sounded too much like one of my dogs, yet neither had made it. I found myself swallowing over and over, trying to rid myself of that sick knot in my throat. A week later, I was preparing dinner in the kitchen when I heard Ginger's distinctive bark near the front door. Only it wasn't quite right. It sounded thinner and slightly higher in pitch, as if someone had recorded her and played it back at a different speed. I called her name and walked over to the hallway, but she was already lying there wagging her tail at me with that goofy grin on her face. She hadn't moved from her spot. I felt a swirl of panic in my gut, a sensation that I was teetering on the edge of something horrifying, who or what could be imitating my dog. For the next few days, I tried to act normal. I made coffee, went to work, played fetch with Moose and Ginger in the backyard, and told myself that houses creak and groan all the time. Yet every single morning before dawn, I would bolt awake to the faint imitation of canine whines, or the distant echo of my own cough from somewhere else in the house. My heart would race and my hands would tremble. The darkness felt alive with secrets just beyond my bedroom door. One afternoon, I was convinced I heard my own voice calling from upstairs. The voice was faint and muffled, but the cadence and tone matched mine perfectly, except it seemed delayed, as though it were a distorted echo from another time. My stomach dropped, a clammy sweat broke across my forehead, and my breathing became shallow and fast. I felt adrenaline surge through me, my muscles tensing, unsure whether to flee the house or confront whoever was upstairs. Summoning the remains of my courage, I climbed the stairs, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The hallway at the top was empty, the air still and stale. I checked every room, flinging open doors, flipping on lights, half expecting to catch a glimpse of some intruder wearing my face. But there was nothing. The only sound was my own shaky breathing echoing in those silent walls. I thought I was losing my mind. I considered telling a friend about these bizarre experiences, but I worried they'd think I was just stressed out or dealing with anxiety. The fear gnawed at me, becoming a constant companion. My appetite dwindled, and I started sleeping with the hallway light on. I noticed the dogs growing skittish too, barking at corners or refusing to enter certain rooms. Sometimes they would both stare at the same spot in the living room, lips curling back in a low growl when I followed their gaze. All I saw was an empty patch of wallpaper, but the intensity in their posture filled me with dread. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the house itself was breathing. Soon I began to sense a presence just behind me, as though someone were leaning over my shoulder. Whenever I paused in the corridors, my palms would sweat and my heart would go wild. Whenever I had to switch off the lights at night, I would see shapes flicker in the edge of my vision. Dark figures that vanished the moment I turned my head. The tension in the air pressed on me like a physical weight. At times, my chest would tighten so badly I feared I might pass out. Things escalated the evening I heard an exact replica of Moose's bark coming from the basement. I had never gone down there because the space made me uncomfortable from day one, but that night the bark came loud and urgent when I found Moose in the kitchen. Instead staring at me with a tilted head, I felt ice in my veins. My heartbeat hammered in my ears. I could barely swallow. There was no reason, none at all, for my dog's bark to come from below ground with my hands shaking so much I could hardly hold a flashlight. I slowly made my way down the creaking steps. Each step felt like a small betrayal of my instincts, as though my body were screaming at me to turn around. The air grew colder and smelled faintly of damp earth. I could hear my ragged breath echoing in the confined space. I tried to keep my flashlight steady, but I couldn't stop trembling at the bottom. I flicked the basement light switch, half expecting it not to work, but a single bulb overhead flickered into a sickly glow. Shadows loomed in the corners, stretching like hungry shapes. I stood there scanning the empty room, the cement floor, the cinder block walls. I noticed cardboard boxes stacked near the far wall, previous occupants' leftovers. The hush was suffocating. My heart was pounding so hard that my vision felt as if it might tunnel. My mind spun. Had I really heard Moose's bark, or had it all been in my head? Just as I was about to retreat upstairs, something skittered behind the boxes. It was a soft scraping noise too large to be a rat. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up as a sharp jolt of fear ripped through me. In that moment, a series of faint whispers seemed to ripple through the basement. Stale air too quiet for me to understand, but definitely there. I bolted up the stairs before I could think twice, tripping on my own feet, and slammed the door behind me. My legs felt weak and a cold sweat slicked my back. I could hardly catch my breath. I stayed awake all night, too terrified to drift off after that basement episode. The imitations became more frequent. Sometimes I would hear my dogs in parts of the house where they couldn't possibly be. Sometimes I would swear I heard my own voice whistling from the kitchen, humming from the bathroom, or humming a tune in the attic. My reflection in the mirror would appear just a split second out of sync, like a bad dream. You can't fully remember when you wake up. I started questioning my sanity, wondering if I was succumbing to some bizarre paranoia. My head throbbed and my entire body remained tense with an ever-present anxiety that never let me rest. One morning, after a particularly sleepless night, I stumbled into the kitchen to make coffee. My eyes felt gritty and my heart pounded with each step, expecting to see something horrifying around every corner. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found. There, standing at the counter, was a figure identical to me in every way. Same disheveled hair, same tired lines under the eyes, same t-shirt wrinkled from a restless sleep. It turned to face me and my vision blurred momentarily. My mind recoiled, refusing to accept the impossibility of what was right in front of me. I couldn't speak. My mouth was so dry it felt like sandpaper, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears. A wave of queasiness rolled through my stomach. All the air seemed to exit my lungs, and I just stood there trembling. My duplicate regarded me with an eerily calm expression. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my muscles locked as though I were trapped in a nightmare. I watched in horror as this doppelganger tilted its head slightly, examining me like a specimen. I recall the entity addressing me in a voice that was mine, yet not mine. Speaking softly, its tone drained of emotion, it explained in essence that it was the living manifestation of the house itself. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or hearing actual words, but I understood the meaning. As surely as if the thoughts had formed in my own brain, it seemed to suggest the house had developed awareness over time, slowly learning from every resident who had ever walked its halls the imitation of voices, animals, and now my own body were the result of that growing consciousness. This thing was making copies, forging physical doubles that existed alongside the originals as it spoke. If speaking is even the right word, I felt an urgent, almost physical sensation that the walls around us were breathing in sync. I remember my heart feeling like it might burst right out of my chest. My vision wavered and a cold sweat drenched my back. My mind couldn't begin to process the magnitude of what I was hearing. Something beyond human understanding was happening. My entire body trembled with fear and disbelief. I wanted to get away, but the floor felt unstable, as if the house was shifting beneath my feet. The entity seemed to exude a slow, deliberate confidence, knowing I had nowhere to run. It communicated through gestures, expressions, or maybe telepathy that the house existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Infinite versions of every inhabitant overlapped in the same space, each dimension layering upon the next until they all merged in this particular structure. At that moment, I became acutely aware of how many people must have lived here before me. Could their duplicates be wandering these halls as well? Intangible shapes crossing from one dimension into the next. I thought about the basement whispers, the barking that echoed from nowhere. The flickers at the edge of my vision, I realized all those sounds could be manifestations of inhabitants and animals. From parallel realities, my breathing sped up so much I became dizzy. My skin was covered in goosebumps, and I felt a sudden urge to claw at the walls, to escape the claustrophobic crush of overlapping existences. The doppelganger fixed me with a look of profound curiosity, as though measuring my next move. I couldn't handle meeting its eyes for too long. They were my eyes, but void of warmth, like looking into a reflection that had no human soul behind it. In that moment, I felt more naked and vulnerable than I had in my entire life. Every hair on my neck stood up. My heart hammered with such ferocity that my chest hurt. I was convinced I might faint my vision. Spotting at the edges, the thing seemed to relish my terror, or at least it observed it carefully, as if studying the physicality of fear. Without daring to speak, I stepped backward. My legs shook knees, threatening to buckle. Moose and Ginger were nowhere to be seen, and a dread crept over me as I realized the house could generate duplicates of them at will. The doppelganger didn't follow me, but I sensed it was allowing me to leave, or maybe it was simply curious to see what I would do next. I forced myself to remain steady as I backed out of the kitchen, never taking my eyes off that figure. My breathing was harsh and the sweat on my forehead felt ice cold. I moved down the hallway, each step sending shocks of pain through my tense muscles. My mind screamed that I had to get out, that I needed to flee, but another part of me wondered what good it would do if the house existed in multiple dimensions. Maybe stepping outside wouldn't offer true escape. The entire property might exist in a web of realities that extended beyond anything I could comprehend. Yet the raw survival instinct took over, telling me I had to try. When I reached the front door, I braced myself for resistance locks jamming or doorknobs refusing to turn. To my astonishment, the knob turned with a quiet click and the door swung open. Daylight spilled in, so bright it made my head spin. My chest heaved as I finally gulped fresh air. I left without looking back. Sprinting down the steps and out into the street, my heartbeat roared in my ears, and I realized tears were streaming down my face. I had no idea where to go or what to do. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. Eventually, I found myself in my car, breath coming in frantic gasps. My shirt clung to my back, soaked with sweat. I fumbled for the keys and drove aimlessly for what felt like hours. My mind replayed the encounter in the kitchen, my own voice, my own face. That unearthly calm, I felt like a coil of nerve endings hyper-R of every sound around me. The dogs were safe with me. I had put them in the back seat. Though I barely remembered doing so in my panic, I kept looking at them in the rearview mirror, making sure they didn't flicker or morph into something else. I don't know if I'll ever sleep peacefully again. The house's explanation, if you can call it that, continues to echo in my thoughts. Perhaps the building has woven itself into countless realities, stacking them on top of each other like pages in an eternal book. And maybe every occupant from decades past to those who might come after still roams its halls in some shape or form. No one died yet. Everyone was duplicated. The mere idea sends cold jolts of horror through my veins. My heart still races at odd hours, my breathing quickens. Whenever I recall those empty eyes reflecting my own face, I have not gone back. I'm not sure what I'll do next, or if moving somewhere else will even matter, because once you've seen what I've seen, you realize that physical boundaries might mean nothing at all. The house exists in multiple dimensions. It can extend its awareness in ways I can't begin to imagine. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I think I hear my name whispered in my own voice, faint but persistent, drifting through the air as though carried from a place far beyond my understanding. My entire body will tense, sweat trickling coldly down my spine, and I'll lie there, eyes wide open, too scared to move. In the end, the worst realization is that escape might be impossible. Even now, I feel as though I'm living in the house's shadow, caught in its gravitational pull. It found a way to copy me, to mimic my every thought and gesture. And if it can do that, once there's nothing to stop it from doing so again, or from reaching out across dimensions to claim me in some other reality, I've become hyper aware of my own reflection, the sound of my own footsteps, the pitch of my voice. Any tiny distortion in my daily routine sets my nerves on edge. Every minor echo or squeak in whatever new dwelling I occupy threatens to spiral me back into that unearthly fear. Even though I'm physically outside its walls, I can't shake the sensation that the house itself is alive, and watching it lingers at the periphery of my existence, half in my memories and half in a dimension that overlaps. This one, I feel it every time I see a window at night, or when a cold draft moves across the room and raises goosebumps on my arms. My heart pounds with the knowledge that somewhere not so far away, my doppelganger might be standing in an identical kitchen waiting for me to return, and that more than anything is the kind of terror that never leaves you. Story 10, I still remember the moment the lights in my office flickered for just an instant, like they were winking at some hidden presence. Even before I answered that eerie phone call, something felt off in the stale air. The familiar hum of the air conditioner seemed to falter, replaced by a silent tension that pressed against my eardrums. It was the kind of silence that makes every tiny sound echo like a gunshot in an abandoned hall. I suddenly felt more alone than I ever had, even though my workspace was supposedly a place of comfort, a place I knew inside and out. Little did I suspect that from that point on, reality itself would twist and warp around me, exposing a side of existence I was never meant to witness. My name is Daniel, and I work as an IT technician. Most days I deal with mundane tasks, fixing slow computers, adjusting network settings, or installing software patches. It's not exactly glamorous, but it keeps my mind busy and my bills paid. That night I was working late, something I often do to avoid heavy morning traffic and to tackle system updates when fewer people are around. The building felt emptier than usual. My footsteps on the hallway tiles reverberated in a strangely hollow way, almost as if each step was swallowed up the moment I took it. I was on my way back from the restroom when I heard my cell phone buzz violently in my pocket, snapping me out of my drowsy trance. At first, I glanced down with casual disinterest, maybe a notification from a messaging app, but I froze when I saw the caller ID. It was my colleague Marcus. He had left earlier that day complaining about a headache and told me he was going to power down his phone while he rested at home. I remembered him making a big show of switching off his device before walking away. We had a couple of jokes about how he'd be dead to the world until morning, unreachable and unresponsive, yet somehow there it was. His name glowing on my screen, the ringtone echoing in the corridor. I answered out of reflex, pressing the phone to my ear. Marcus, I barely breathed his name, half expecting silence on the other end. Instead, I heard a faint hiss of static that made my skin prickle. No direct voice came through, but I caught a muffled distortion like a radio between stations. Interspersed with heavy breaths, I spoke again more forcefully, hoping it was just a network glitch. Then the line crackled and I heard something akin to words. It was difficult to parse, but it sounded like my name repeated in a drawn-out, ominous whisper. I felt a sudden chill race up the back of my neck, intensifying the dryness in my mouth. I asked if he was okay, but only static responded. My heartbeat pounded so loudly that I wondered if it was audible through the phone. Then the call cut out, leaving me with the deafening silence of the empty hallway shaken. I told myself it had to be a prank or some bizarre technical glitch. I reminded myself that phones can do strange things. Sometimes maybe Marcus's phone had restarted itself, or maybe his battery was more alive than he realized. Still, something about the strange hiss, those faint breaths, and that distorted version of my own name sent waves of nausea through my stomach. I hurried back to my cubicle, desperate to shrug off the incident by returning to routine tasks. My workstation greeted me with a screen full of software updates in progress. I forced myself to focus on them. pretending that the world was still sensible, yet my mind refused to settle. My eyes darted nervously to the phone in case it rang again, my pulse continuing to flutter in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to type a quick message to Marcus on our company chat platform asking if he had called. The message just sat there marked as unread. Trying to distract myself, I busied my hands with rebooting a server, but as soon as I initiated the process, the server's monitor glitched. Violently, lines of text scrolled across at inhuman speed, displaying strange symbols and a flickering image of what looked like an office almost identical to mine. The lighting was dimmer with a sickly yellow tint, and shadows seemed to sprawl in unnatural angles. My chest tightened when I noticed that the figure seated at that other desk was me. At least it looked like me, but the person's face was contorted in a silent scream, eyes wide mouth stretched as if in perpetual terror. The screen flickered back to normal within seconds, leaving me staring at the usual login prompt. I rubbed my eyes, searching for a rational explanation. Perhaps my exhaustion was playing tricks on me, or maybe some malware had messed with the video output. Still, I found myself trembling. I could feel the cold sweat forming on my forehead, and my breath came in shallow staccato gasps. Every nerve in my body buzzed with tension, telling me that what I had just seen wasn't some ordinary glitch needing answers. I rushed to the surveillance room next door, where security feeds from all over the building were displayed. The corridor cameras, the stairwell feed, the parking lot. Everything looked normal. That provided me with a small fleeting relief. Yet as I switched from camera to camera, I noticed an unused feed had activated on its own. It showed an angle of our workspace, but skewed as if taken from a corner that didn't actually exist. The resolution was grainy, bathed in a monochromatic gloom. At first I wasn't sure what I was seeing, just a vague figure moving among rows of desks that mirrored our office layout. But again, the lighting was wrong, drenched in a clammy darkness that seemed alive. Then the figure turned, its eyes glinted unnaturally, reflecting light like an animal at night. I couldn't make out the facial features, but the shape reminded me of a colleague who definitely wasn't there at that time. My stomach clenched so hard I felt dizzy. Panicking, I tried to record the feed or switch the camera off, but the controls on the software became unresponsive. My hands shook as I repeatedly clicked the mouse, each futile click echoing in the claustrophobic room. Then the feed vanished, replaced by a cryptic error message. I was left facing the ordinary rows of real-time security feeds again, each showing an empty hallway or a silent office. The sense of being watched grew unbearable. I felt eyes at the back of my head. My breathing was shallow, heart racing. I could almost taste the metallic tang of adrenaline on my tongue. Desperate for a rational explanation, I decided to check the building's electrical systems. I took the elevator down to the basement where the main power units were located. The elevator ride felt like descending into a tomb. The overhead light flickered in a nauseating strobe, making me break into a cold sweat. I swore I could hear faint whispers impossible to pinpoint, echoing in the cramped, stale air. When I finally reached the basement, a dull hum filled the space. Vibrating through my chest, the flicker of distant, faulty lighting cast dancing shadows that played havoc with my peripheral vision. No matter where I turned, I felt like someone was standing just behind me, but every time I whipped around, the corridor was empty. Reaching the electrical room, I checked the power grid, but everything appeared normal. No surges or drops to explain the anomalies I'd witnessed. There was a moment, though, where I thought I heard my name again, carried on a breath of air that slithered through the corridor. It made the hairs on my arms stand upright. It sounded exactly like the hiss I'd heard on Marcus's call. Suddenly, I wished I weren't alone. My fear felt palpable, turning the very air I breathed into a dense, suffocating fog, unable to stay in that subterranean gloom any longer. I took the elevator back up during the ride. I tried to text Marcus again, but the messaging app froze. Then in a single blink, the phone's screen turned black, reflecting only my own anxious eyes and quivering mouth. In that reflection, I could have sworn I saw a shape behind me. Impossible. Since I was alone in the elevator, I pivoted in panic, but there was nothing there. Just the dull metal walls of the lift, My heart pounded so hard it made my vision blur. The elevator doors finally opened with a harsh metallic scrape, and I almost stumbled out feeling as though I'd escaped a tightening trap once. Back in the office area, I headed to my cubicle, determined to pack up and leave, but as I approached my computer screen, lit up by itself showing an email supposedly from me sent to my own address at the exact current time. The subject line read, "They're almost here." Fear clawed at my chest. My throat felt parched, and a warm flush pulsed through my body, soon replaced by a chilling numbness. I opened the email half expecting more unsettling imagery. Instead, I found a single line of text: "We are waiting." The words seemed to stare back at me like an ominous verdict. I tried to turn off the computer, but it resisted each command. The monitor flickered to an image of another me, a version sporting a haunted expression and unnaturally pale skin, typing frantically at a desk that could have been mine, except it was littered with rotting electronics and cables strewn like dead vines. Then the screen blinked and went dark. I was left with my own reflection, eyes wide, sweat dripping down my temple. I tried to reason with myself: exhaustion, stress, a possible cyber attack, or advanced hacking. These were all more plausible than an actual parallel dimension, but reason felt shaky at best. I recalled the server glitch, the surveillance anomaly, the phone call from a device supposedly powered off piece by piece. It painted a picture too bizarre to dismiss. My eyes darted around the office, each shadow dancing in the peripheral edges of my vision, each fluorescent light flicker striking a bolt of paranoia into my mind. Time seemed to stretch thin, as though the building itself existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the city. The usual traffic noises outside had dulled to near silence, and even the hum of the vending machine seemed muted. The gloom pressed in on me until I felt I was suffocating by now. Fear had turned physical. My throat was raw, my stomach churned, and my limbs shook with every step. I couldn't decide if leaving was wise or if I should stay to gather more concrete evidence, but I knew I needed to get some distance from whatever was happening. Grabbing my bag, I sprinted toward the exit, passing rows of silent workstations. The overhead lights buzzed erratically, flickering in sync with the pounding of my heart as I neared the main door. My phone vibrated once more. Reluctantly, I glanced at the screen. It was the same unknown dimension feed again, except it wasn't a camera feed anymore. It was a live video call request. The thumbnail preview showed an office disturbingly similar to my own, bathed in that same sickly yellowish glow I'd seen earlier. A figure stood near the door. In that parallel space, my spine tingled when I saw that the figure wore an outfit exactly like mine, the same checkered shirt, the same navy pants. He was even holding a phone up to his ear. Something about that version of me stared out with a hollow gaze, as if scanning for a crack between worlds. I could almost feel his eyes locked on my face. Bridging the gap through the device in my hand, my heart seized with terror. I fought the urge to answer, then a text notification popped up on the screen. "Please let me in." A cold sweat drenched my back. Every instinct screamed at me to reject the call, to sever this link before it grew any stronger. With shaking fingers, I powered my phone down and pulled the battery, nearly dropping the device in my panic. For several seconds, I stood there in a haze, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then the overhead lights flickered again, dimming so severely that the corridor transformed into a tunnel of shadows. I heard the faint whisper of my name slithering through the air vents or from behind the walls. It was impossible to tell. The desire to flee took over. Overriding every other thought, I yanked the building door open, stumbling into the night outside. A harsh wind blasted my face, carrying the sting of city pollution mixed with the metallic taste of pending rain. Street lights buzzed overhead, but they seemed weaker than usual, as though the darkness of the office was leaking into the outside world. My heart pounded with residual terror, and my thoughts whirled in a relentless loop. Did I just connect with another reality, or was my mind unraveling under stress? I took a moment to study myself against a concrete pillar, focusing on the gritty texture under my palms, trying to anchor myself in the real world. My breath felt icy in my chest, and my pulse hammered behind my ears. I told myself I had to find Marcus and figure out what was going on, or at least confirm he was okay, but my phone was often disassembled and I didn't dare turn it back on. Eventually, I made my way home, the sense of being followed refusing to leave me in every reflection. On passing windows, I half expected to glimpse that warped version of me lurking behind. When I reached my apartment, I found the lights flickering just like in the office. My home router kept rebooting, flooding my screen. With error messages about unknown networks detected, although terrified, I resolved to push through. I reconnected my phone battery long enough to send a single message to Marcus, this time from a laptop using a secure chat platform. Within seconds, a reply came, "Stop, it's too late." That was all he wrote, no explanation, no reassurance. I stared at those words, feeling a creeping dread spread through my limbs. My heart sank and a trembling unease anchored me to the spot. Could Marcus have been trapped in that parallel dimension, or was he warning me about the merging of realities? The implications thundered in my mind. I locked every door, turned off every electronic device I could, yet I felt powerless. An oppressive gloom settled over my apartment, and the shadows in every corner seemed to shift as if eagerly waiting for the barrier to erode completely. I spent the rest of the night in a kind of watchful paralysis, expecting every flicker of light to reveal something horrifying. Each time I began to drift into a half sleep, a distant mechanical groan or electronic hum jolted me awake, sending new waves of panic coursing through my veins. By the time the first gray hints of dawn appeared, I felt hollowed out, drained from the battle against an unseen force that lurked beyond comprehension. Now, whenever I walk into the office, I find myself wondering if that next flicker of the screen will show me the other side again. If my phone buzzes unexpectedly, my muscles tense in readiness to fling the device across the room. I've become hypervigilant, distrustful of every shadow, every reflection. I can't shake the feeling that this phenomenon isn't over, that it's only lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Marcus has been avoiding me since that chilling message, and I can't force him to explain anything. Perhaps he too is trying to run from something he can't fully understand. Yet one lingering thought gnaws at my sanity. If the barrier truly weakens, if the technology we rely on keeps bridging the gap between our dimension and that twisted mirror world, what happens when they finally collide? My nightmares are filled with images of overlapping realities, of entire buildings flickering in and out of existence, of the other me stepping through into my world, leaving me trapped in his place each day. A sense of claustrophobic doom tightens around me, driving me to check every screen, every line of code, every hum in the wires. I haven't found any definitive answers, nor have I discovered a foolproof way to seal the rift. All I know is that it's still there, an invisible fracture in the fabric of. Normally, sometimes in the corner of my vision, I see that flicker of yellowish light, the silhouette of that other office superimposed on my own, and every time I sense it, my heart rate spikes cold sweat beads along my hairline and my breathing becomes shallow. I hold on to hope that I might keep this threat at bay if I remain vigilant, but there's no certainty in that. The phone calls, the emails, the mirrored images, they could begin again at any moment. The relentless tension weighs heavily on me, a constant reminder that we are not alone in our reality, that somewhere on the other side of the veil something watches and waits. And though I tell myself I'm prepared, the truth is that no one can ever be fully ready for the day. Two worlds converge. The only certainty I have left is the persistent gut-wisting fear that when it happens, it may already be far too late for any of us to go back. Story 11, I still remember the first time I sensed something was wrong in my house. The air itself felt heavier than usual, as if it carried a burden of secrets in every draft that brushed against my skin. Shadows seemed to pull along the edges of the furniture when no light should have cast them. There was a constant low hum in the silence, just perceptible enough to stir the hair at the back of my neck that night. My throat closed up in a sudden wave of terror, and my heart pounded so fiercely that I could hear the blood rushing through my ears. I lay awake, cold sweat dripping down my temples. Convinced I wasn't alone, the house felt alive, or worse, like it was no longer entirely of this world. My life used to be methodical, an orderly routine that offered comfort. I would start my mornings with coffee, black in the same chipped mug I've had for years. I'd shower, check my emails, then head to work. Evenings, I'd come home, warm dinner, and watch the news until I grew tired. That routine gave me a sense of control over my surroundings. But everything began to crack the moment objects started disappearing. At first, I dismissed it as plain forgetfulness, a pair of keys that I later found inside the fridge, a wallet that turned up in the bathroom cabinet, or a missing book that somehow ended up in the attic. I told myself it was just me being absent-minded after all. I had a stressful project at work. It was easy to write these incidents off as harmless lapses of memory, yet the feeling in my chest never shook free. That sense of something watching me, silently amused by my confusion. Then the vanishings turned systematic. My watch would disappear on a Thursday and reappear on a Saturday, in some bizarre place like tucked behind a dusty picture frame in the hallway. A set of silverware vanished for days, only to reemerge perfectly arranged on the old trunk in the living room. An odd arrangement that reminded me of a compass rose. I started to record the dates and times, convinced there was a pattern. My hands trembled each time I made a note, as if on some instinctive level. My body knew what I was uncovering should never have been touched. Over a span of weeks, I discovered a chilling consistency. Every disappearance aligned with specific dates correlating to intervals that formed a cryptic cycle. I compared my notes to various calendars, lunar phases, old farming almanacs, even obscure mythological feasts in one obscure text. I found online I came across references to a lunar solar ritual calendar. My heart hammered so painfully when I recognized the intervals. They matched the pattern I charted exactly every time. An object returned. It was changed in some minute yet uncanny way. My coffee mug, for instance, felt cooler to the touch, like the ceramic had been mixed with metal. There was a slight discoloration, a swirl of strange marbling in the glaze. Another item, a small wooden box my grandfather had given me, came back with oddly elongated hinges that looked organic, almost like insect legs. Each reappearing object felt heavier or had an unfamiliar texture. I tried to ignore the gnawing sense that they were no longer wholly real or that they belonged to something else. My dreams grew restless in them. I saw that same faint marbling or insect-like geometry embedded in the walls of my house. I'd wake up sweaty and shaking, convinced the corners of the bedroom had elongated during the night. The darkness felt alive, shifting at the edges of my vision. I'd sit up panting in bed with clammy sheets clinging to my body, certain I heard something skitter beneath the floorboards. But when I listened, truly listened, all I could make out was my own ragged breath. I started to experience a low buzz in my ears whenever I approached one of these changed objects. It was a nauseating vibration that seemed to emanate from inside my skull. If I touched the object with my bare hands, my palms would tingle uncomfortably. I felt my pulse quicken and my heart rate skyrocketed. Whenever I held onto it for more than a moment, my throat would go bone dry and my vision sometimes blurred. There were times I nearly fainted, dizzy with a twisting sense of displacement like stepping into a carnival mirror. The more I researched, the clearer it became. These repeated cycles of disappearance and reappearance were some form of ritual. The items I owned were being used in elaborate intervals, almost as if they were keys unlocking a sequence of doors. One night I found a reference that made my blood run cold. It spoke of other worldly entities that anchored themselves to our reality by co-opting mundane items. Each time an object crosses the boundary between our dimension and theirs, it returns changed. An extension of that foreign place, my mind recoiled from the idea of something using my belongings to gain a foothold here. But it made a horrifying kind of sense. The pattern was too exact, too methodical. I began marking the next expected disappearance on my calendar, dreading the moment it would happen, and it always did on schedule. My hands trembled uncontrollably each time I noticed something missing. My breathing became shallow skin crawling with the sensation of invisible eyes pinned on me. It was as if I were living in a labyrinth rigged by an unseen puppeteer. I tried to explain the situation to a friend I spoke indirectly about things. vanishing, objects returning, changed about a possible intruder in my home. My friend's initial reaction was a mix of disbelief and concern for my mental state. I caught glimpses of pity in his eyes. He said it sounded like I was overworked, that maybe it was stress. I didn't argue after all. I couldn't prove any of it without sounding unhinged, but I began to wonder if I truly was losing my mind. I could feel my paranoia intensifying every creak in the house, made my pulse spike each gust of wind, made me jump at night. I could hardly sleep, consumed by the dread of what might vanish next. On the day the clock from my living room disappeared, a dreadful quiet settled over the house. There was no normal sense of time. It was replaced by a persistent gloom that weighed on me like a physical force. I paced around checking each corner. My body felt stiff, my muscles tensing with every step. My nerves were so raw that even the flicker of a light bulb caused me to jerk in alarm. The hum in the air grew louder, and I sensed that the boundary between my home and somewhere else was thinning. When the clock reappeared 3 days later, I found it inside the attic. It was balanced precariously on a half-rotten beam. My heart thundered in my chest when I saw that its face had changed. The numbers had elongated, winding across the clock's surface. In serpentine curves, the hands moved in a strange, erratic pattern, ticking in short bursts that sent a jolt of panic through my body. Each time they advanced, I refused to touch it with my bare skin, using thick gloves to carry it down the moment I held it. I felt a deep vibration like a pulse that belonged to something much larger. I forced myself to place it in the living room again, not sure what else to do. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I had to sit on the sofa to keep my head from spinning. As the nights passed, I started sensing the presence more acutely. I was convinced some half-formed thing had attached itself to these objects, gradually seeping into my home. My body went cold whenever I approached one of the changed items, as though crossing into a pocket of glacial air at times. I swore I saw small flickers of movement in the corners, blurs that vanished the moment I turned to focus on them. Once I glimpsed what I can only describe as a cluster of jointed limbs scuttling along the baseboard behind my realtored coffee mug. My lungs spasmed with terror, and I dropped the mug, shattering it into shards that quivered on the floor. But the next day I found it whole again, perched back on the kitchen counter as if I had never broken it. It became clear that the entity manipulating these items was pushing against the boundaries of my reality. I'd run my fingertips along a wall and find its texture rippled as though the paint were turning to tissue. My reflection in the mirror sometimes seemed to lag a half second behind, making my heart hammer with the realization that I might not be looking at myself alone. The house itself grew more oppressive. The lights flickered in ways that made me feel cornered by the shadows, and the constant droning in my ears turned into throbbing headaches. My chest tightened as though some enormous weight pressed on me from inside the walls. I realized the objects were more than just anchors, they were active conduits. Each time I touched them, some intangible part of me felt tugged away, like I was losing bits of my sense of self. I believed the entity was forging a link not just to my house, but to me personally. Sleepless nights became the norm, my mind sinking deeper into a haze. My breathing was chronically shallow, my heart rate perpetually high. Even my sense of taste changed. Everything I ate seemed tainted by a metallic bitterness, desperate for a solution. I began studying old folklore about warding off dimensional creatures. I read about cleansing rituals, protective symbols, and ways to sever connections. Most of it seemed like superstition, yet I clung to every method that could potentially help. I burned herbs and scattered salt. I carved strange marks above the doorways, my shaky hands barely able to hold the knife. The house smelled of burnt sage and panic. My only hope was that anything might hold the entity at bay when the final major disappearance occurred. A heavy trunk that had been in my family for years. I knew the last step of the ritual was about to unfold. The trunk vanished on the exact date I had predicted, just as the cryptic cycle demanded. My throat went dry and my palms sweated uncontrollably as I realized the next reappearance would mark a pivotal moment. If the trunk returned, changed, It might become the ultimate anchor for that crawling chaos. Every breath felt like I was inhaling shards of ice. Fear rattled my ribcage like a cage about to break for days. I was too terrified to sleep. I drank cup after cup of black coffee, ignoring the trembling in my hands. My eyes burned from staying awake, and sometimes the lines of reality blurred, twisting the shape of the walls around me. Occasionally, I thought I heard my own voice echoing from empty rooms as if something was learning to mimic me. I tried to muster my courage, telling myself I would face this head on, but each time I pictured the trunk's return, my body broke out in a cold sweat, and I was swallowed by a wave of nausea that left me reeling when it finally reappeared. I found it in the center of the living room, half covered by flickering shadows that seemed to dance without any source of light. My heart thundered so violently I thought it might burst. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to approach the trunk's surface had become something else entirely. It was no longer just wood and metal. It glistened with a dark sheen as though coated with organic slime. Strange patterns undulated across it, swirling symbols that pulsed in time with my own heartbeat. I sensed it was awake, aware a living gateway between my world and that forsaken dimension. I stepped closer, breaths ragged, every muscle tense like a coiled spring. My mind raced. If this trunk truly was the final key, then maybe destroying it would sever the creature's link. I tried to recall any protective ritual from my research. My thoughts were a frantic whirl, but desperation overrode reason. I grabbed a hammer from the closet, and despite the trembling in my arms, I lifted it high above the trunk before I could strike the trunk. Emitted a quiet, resonant sound that was neither mechanical nor entirely organic. I froze my grip, faltering. It was as if it were trying to speak, or perhaps warn me of what might happen if I destroyed it. For a moment I questioned if I was making a terrible mistake. Maybe smashing this object would rip a hole in reality. Perhaps it would unleash the entity in full force. My breath came in shallow gasps, sweat stinging my eyes, but I couldn't let the creeping chaos continue to replace pieces of my home, maybe even me, summoning what little courage remained. I brought the hammer down. The sound that erupted didn't belong in this world. It was a distorted shriek that tore through my ears, reverberating in my lungs like shockwaves. Pain flared in my head, and for a split second everything went dark. The next thing I remember, I found myself kneeling on the floorhead, spinning the hammer still clutched in my hand. The trunk was cracked open, leaking a viscous liquid that shimmered in the dim light. I felt an icy wind blow through the house, and the stench of decay and ozone choked me with all my remaining strength. I swung the hammer again and again, each blow igniting fresh bursts of that unnatural sound. My arms burned and my vision blurred, but I kept striking until the trunk was reduced to splintered wreckage. The moment it was destroyed, the humming in the air cut out. Abruptly, silence enveloped me in overwhelming quiet that felt like a vacuum. I crawled away from the wreckage, struggling to steady my breath. My heart felt as though it might tear free from my chest. Slowly, I stood, every muscle trembling. The shadows around the splintered trunk seemed less dense. Losing that alien shimmer, I sensed the house was returning to itself. Reality reasserting its dominance. I've spent weeks trying to reconcile what happened. The house is quieter now, and so am I. I find no pleasure in my old routines. The coffee tastes bland. The television's background noise grates on my nerves some nights. I still wake drenched in sweat, half convinced I can hear that distant humming. My mind replays the moment I shattered the trunk over and over, as though it's a dream I might still be trapped inside. It's impossible to fully erase the memory of that thing's presence, or to shake the feeling that a fragment of its reality might still linger in the corners I've considered fleeing. Abandoning the house altogether, yet part of me believes I could never truly escape. There's an intangible thread that ties me to what happened here, a faint residue of that alternate dimension clinging to my consciousness. I can't be certain the ritual was undone completely, only that I disrupted its final step. The entity may still lurk in the gap it created, waiting for another chance to seep through. Even so, I refuse to let fear dictate my every breath. I tell myself I have regained some control, I work slowly, room by room, wiping away any traces of that night. I recite quiet affirmations under my breath. Though each one rings hollow, the house no longer feels like a stranger, but it doesn't feel entirely like my home either. There's an undercurrent of tension, a reminder of the fragile boundaries we live within. In the end, I learned that facing the unknown can twist your perceptions in irreversible ways. Some nights, when a certain tension draws across the air, I sense that the boundaries between worlds are thin in those moments. My pulse races and my throat tightens, and I find myself listening for the quiet click of objects vanishing or the wet slithering sound of something returning. The dread has become a part of me, an uneasy companion I cannot exercise. I left that trunk in splinters, but the entity that used it as a doorway may still lurk on the other side, abiding its time for now. At least this house remains standing in our world, and I remain alive within it. That alone should grant some measure of relief. Yet it's precisely in those moments of relief that I sense the faint hum begin anew, resonating just beneath the threshold of hearing, reminding me that some horrors can never be fully banished, only held at bay for as long as our fraying reality continues to endure. Story 12, I knew something was wrong the moment I heard the slow dripping sound behind my bedroom wall. That night, the streetlights outside seemed dimmer than usual. Casting pale shards of light through my thin curtains, the air felt too thick to breathe, somehow charged with an unsettling dampness that made my throat constrict. My heart thumped faster than normal. I tried to tell myself it was just the plumbing acting up, or that I had left a faucet slightly open, but deep down, the persistent tap, tap, tap resonated like a distant echo from the ocean's depths, warning me of something I was not yet prepared to face. My name is Daniel, and I've lived in this cramped one-bedroom apartment for nearly a year. It is on a quiet street bordered by an abandoned parking lot and an old liquor store. The walls are plain, almost colorless, and the floors creak. If you step in just the right spots, it's not much, but for a while it was enough lately. However, I have begun to feel that I am not the only inhabitant of this space. At first, it was a tingle on the back of my neck whenever I passed the small hallway mirror, as though someone lingered just beyond my reflection. Then came the faint, salty taste in the air, as if a sea breeze was drifting past my nose. Even though I lived nowhere near the coast, the smell clung to my clothes and hair, refusing to dissipate. I tried to brush it off as paranoia. I told myself that it was the stress of work or an overactive imagination fueled by too many late-night horror movies, but the sensations grew while lying in bed. I would sometimes hear a low, raspy breath inches from my ear. Other nights I jolted awake with my heart pounding, convinced I felt cold. Droplets of water trickling down my arms, though my sheets remained inexplicably dry. These moments set my pulse racing so violently that I had to sit up gasping for air. Each inhalation sharp and painful. The first time I saw him was a night like any other. I had been dozing off, half lost in some confusing dream about bottomless whirlpools. I woke to a flicker at the foot of my bed. The room was too dark for clear vision, but in that darkness I glimpsed a silhouette that made every hair on my body stand on end. He looked old, dressed in rags that might have once been a sailor's uniform. A large brimmed hat shadowed most of his features, but I could make out long strands of seaweed-like hair draped across a sunken face next to him. Something lower to the ground, roughly the size of a large dog, shifted in place. I felt rather than heard a presence, a spectral form that resembled a sea lion but moved in unnatural silence. Panic constricted my throat. I froze, trying not to breathe, certain I was still dreaming. Then the figure and the strange companion were gone as quickly as they had appeared. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. My heart hammered relentlessly. My skin felt clammy, as if I'd been splashed with ocean water. I stayed up pacing back and forth in my living room, turning on all the lights in an effort to force the darkness away. Over the next few days, I fought to maintain a semblance of normalcy. I went to work, typed up reports, and endured small talk with colleagues. Yet something had changed in me. My hands trembled at the slightest provocation. The tension in my neck and shoulders was unbearable. Each time I blinked, I saw that old sailor's silhouette etched on the back of my eyelids. Friends asked if I was ill or if I'd gone on a bender. I claimed I was fine, but feared they could sense my growing paranoia. My mouth would go dry even when I was sipping water. My lungs felt constricted as though I was inhaling brine instead of air. It wasn't long before the walls themselves began to betray me. I noticed wet streaks forming near the baseboards of the bedroom. The water looked almost oily, shimmering with an iridescent sheen in the dim light. When I ran my finger along one streak, I tasted salt on my skin, sharp and undeniable. The slow drip behind my wall became more persistent, echoing at random intervals day and night, driving me to the edge of my sanity. Maintenance staff insisted there was no leak and brushed off my complaints, suggesting maybe a spill or a condensation one evening. While I was brushing my teeth, I sensed movement behind me. I turned to see the faint outline of that sea lion-like creature. Its eyes glowed with a haunting phosphorescence, a cold green that seemed both curious and malevolent. I whipped around, nearly choking on toothpaste in the mirror. I briefly caught the reflection of that old mariner again, hunched in the corner of the room, water dripping from his hat. But when I spun back, my bathroom was empty. My heart was pounding so hard my ribs hurt. I felt short of breath, as though the air had been siphoned out of the room, leaving me with nothing but stale, suffocating dread. I began to question my grip on reality, stress, sleep deprivation, or maybe I was losing my mind outright. Yet every night the dreams of sinking into cold black water persisted. I'd wake up gasping, my lungs cramped and burning. Then one particularly horrifying morning I found gill-like slits around my neck, thin inflamed lines that felt tender to the touch. It was impossible to remain calm. I nearly collapsed in front of the mirror, panic turning my stomach to ice. My heartbeat thundered in my ears and a film of sweat coated my entire body. I tried to reassure myself that it was some bizarre rash, perhaps an allergic reaction. But the next night I dreamt of breathing underwater, gasping in lungfuls of salty water while dark shapes floated around me. The transformation of my apartment escalated at an alarming pace. The persistent smell of salt hung over everything. Puddles of water appeared in corners of the living room with no apparent source. The windows grew foggy, almost like portholes trapped in a dense fog at sea. Some nights I felt surges of invisible currents swirling around my legs, as though the floor itself had become a shallow tide pool. My chest tightened constantly, as if anticipating a fresh wave of dread at every turn. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, curiosity nodded at me. I started leaving out scraps of paper, meticulously noting the times when I heard the dripping or caught a glimpse of that spectral duo. I became fixated on patterns, as though deciphering them would unlock the reason behind all this. I even tried to call out to the presence, though I mostly did so under my breath. Uncertain if I truly wanted a response through these hushed appeals, I began to sense that the old mariner was not just a random haunting. He felt ancient, burdened by centuries of knowledge, and the spectral sea lion always lurking at his side seemed like a guardian or an emissary of something far older than I could comprehend. The nights grew heavier. My breathing would change as I slept, rattling through those strange slits on my neck, leaving me half suffocated by morning. Strangest of all, I stopped feeling frightened of actual drowning. Instead, I developed an odd dread of dryness. My lips cracked, my throat burned. I found myself craving the taste of salt water, often standing in a hot shower just to inhale the steam, letting it collect in my lungs. My reflection in the mirror grew gaunt, my eyes hollow and wide. I'd stare at the lines on my neck, gently parting them to see if they really opened into something more. My breath would stutter each time my fingertips brushed those ridges, a shiver rippling through me like a plunging ocean current. There was a night I will never forget this. When the mariner seemed to speak, though his speech was more a collection of gurgles and whispers that scraped the inside of my mind rather than my ears. The words, or the essence of them, implied he was a guardian of ancient forbidden knowledge from the ocean's deepest trenches. He had come to show me truths about realms hidden far below the surface, about creatures and gods best left undisturbed. I felt my stomach flip. My hands shook uncontrollably. Those impressions brought with them the distinct smell of sea rot and the faint cry of distant storms. My heart felt like it might burst from my chest. I wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but listen. Yet an inexplicable fascination held me in place. Soon after, the physical environment of my home took an even more sinister turn at night. Phosphorescent shapes glided across my walls, swirling and shifting like schools of deep sea fish. The ceiling became draped in a murky, swirling darkness that pulsed in tandem with my heartbeat. My furniture seemed to grow damp with salt residue flecked with bits of algae. My television flickered with images of rolling ocean waves even when it was powered off. The constant drip behind my walls was now accompanied by a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards. My ankles would tingle as if something brushed against them, a near weightless pull that reminded me of underwater currents. It was around this time that I became truly unstable. My appetite dwindled, replaced by an unquenchable thirst. I'd stand at the sink, letting cold water trickle into my palms, trying to taste that salty tang I craved. My nights were filled with a harsh cacophony of half sounds: the bark of a distant sea lion, the echo of an old horn from a ghost ship, and the scraping chant of a mariner reciting lines in a forgotten tongue. Each noise sent a jolt through my nervous system, making me break out in a cold sweat that soaked my shirt and left my skin clammy. I avoided contact with others. My coworkers commented that I looked as if I'd spent a week underwater. A neighbor tried to ask if I was all right, remarking on the water dripping from beneath my door, but I brushed him off. My voice shook whenever I tried to form sentences, and I could hardly meet his gaze. Eventually, the transformation reached a point where my apartment no longer felt like a place meant for humans. Entire sections of the floor were slick. The air was perpetually humid, pressing in on me, saturating my clothing. Strange flickers of light shimmered under tables and chairs as if small bioluminescent creatures darted about just out of view. At times, I sensed an undertow below my feet, forcing me to fight for balance. If I dared to stand still too long, I swore I was sinking, my ankles slowly disappearing into a gelatinous darkness, only to re-emerge when I panicked and scrambled away one night with my mind spinning. I recalled that the mariner seemed to carry some secret if he had knowledge. Perhaps he also held a key to escaping this twisting reality. My terror warred with my desire for release from this aquatic prison. So I waited wide awake in the living room, feeling the intangible current swirl around me. The sea lion appeared first, emerging from a shadow near the couch. Its translucent body glowed faintly, and I could see shifting shapes of bones and sinew beneath its surface. My pulse thundered as the mariner stepped out from the darkness. Next, water dripped from his brimmed hat, sliding down his hollow cheeks and frayed coat. My breath caught, and a harsh dryness seized my throat as if the very humidity had turned to salt within my lungs. I tried to communicate, though what I uttered was more a series of gasps and half-choked croakies. I cannot recall the exact words, if there even were coherent words. I remember the mariner raising a waterlogged hand and pointing to the back wall, the one nearest my bedroom. There the salty stains had grown until they resembled an open gash, an entryway to something darker. My vision blurred with fear, chest spasming, heart thumping like a desperate drumbeat. I felt compelled to move closer, every muscle in my body. Seizing up with tension, my legs trembled, my teeth clenched so hard I thought they might crack behind me. I sensed the sea lion's cool, moist breath on my legs. Nudging me forward, when I reached the wall, I touched the largest salt stain. It was soft, almost like it was breathing. I pushed gently, and a rush of briny water gushed over my hand. The mariner's voice, or what I perceived as his voice, flooded my mind with images of swirling black pits in the ocean floor, monstrous silhouettes writhing in total darkness, and incomprehensible knowledge guarded by them. My lungs seized the gill slits on my neck, fluttered, drawing in air with unnatural effort. I realized with a jolt of revulsion and awe that I was starting to breathe through them. My chest tightened again, and I stumbled backward, tears burning my eyes. The shapes on the walls grew more distinct. Looming in the gloom, they seemed to whisper wordlessly of unearthly depths. The mariner took a step closer, his posture a chilling invitation, and in that moment I felt an overwhelming surge of panic. It was the primal dread that warns you to stay away from the edge of the unknown. Everything in me screamed to reject this twisted metamorphosis. For a split second, my mind cleared enough to sense that I still had a choice to deny this dark revelation or plunge fully into it. So I fled. I grabbed my coat and bolted through the apartment door, half expecting the watery floor to grab hold of my ankles. The corridor outside was bright and ordinary. The sudden dryness shocking my breath came in ragged gasps, and I stumbled down the hall, ignoring the pounding in my ears. I did not look back. I wandered the city streets until sunrise. The fresh air felt both liberating and suffocating my lungs, caught between wanting to draw normal breath and longing for the humidity I had fled. Eventually, I checked into a cheap motel. I slept fitfully, waking repeatedly with salt clinging to my lips. My neck gills flared and pulsed, but gradually receded to faint lines as the hours passed. Any attempt to understand what had happened left me in shambles. My thoughts spun in endless circles, my heart drumming out a relentless staccato against my rib cage. Even now, I cannot fully explain the nature of what I experienced in that apartment. I returned once in daylight, accompanied by the landlord, to retrieve my belongings. We found nothing out of the ordinary. No dripping walls, no damp floors, no pungent salt odor. Everything was just as bland and lifeless as when I first moved in, but I felt it, the lingering presence, and so did he, judging. By the way he kept glancing nervously at corners and lowering his voice, I packed a suitcase and left without further comment. I cannot say I am free. Every so often I catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, a hunched figure in a wide-brimmed hat, and the blurred shape of a spectral sea lion in my dreams. I still inhale water through gills drifting through inky black water. There is a tension in my throat and a sting in my nose whenever I taste salt. A single drip of water in a quiet room can send my pulse skyrocketing. I do not know if the old mariner was offering me forbidden knowledge or a gateway to my own destruction. The memory clings to me like sea foam, a living testament that reality can slip out from under you, like wet sand beneath bare feet. I have left that apartment, yet I carry the ocean with me. The faint lines on my neck sometimes itch, and I wake from nightmares in a cold, salty sweat. I suspect I have only delayed the inevitable, but for now I remain above the surface, haunted by those bottomless depths I have narrowly escaped, certain that one night when the moon is just right, the waves will rise again to claim me, carry some secret if he had knowledge. Perhaps he also held a key to escaping this twisting reality, that something was off. It wasn't rain, it wasn't hail. It was the sort of noise that had no place in an empty road cutting across farmland at night. My heart started to pound before my brain could even process why I felt so uneasy. There was an electric tension in the air, the kind that makes your skin tingle with apprehension. I remember glancing up at the moon veiled in thick rolling clouds and thinking I had never seen the night so black. That was when I first saw the barrier of hay bales arranged in a neat, impossible wall right across the road. I'd been hauling a trailer full of feed and supplies through back roads seeking a shortcut. The official detour was nearly 50 miles longer, and time was money pulling up to those hay bales. I expected to see someone, a farmer or a ranch hand, jump out to explain why they were blocking the entire lane, but there was no one. No light, no houses nearby, no sign of recent activity. Just that tall row of bales, silhouetted by my headlights, looking eerily precise and deliberate. For a moment I hesitated, thinking about turning back, but curiosity overrode caution. Something in me insisted I take a closer look, so I cut the engine, flicked on my flashlight, and stepped out. The crunch of the gravel under my boots sounded deafening in the stillness. The night air was cold enough to sting my lungs, and the odor of damp hay hung heavy as I examined those bales. A chill that had nothing to do with the wind prickled my spine. The bales were stacked perfectly, locked together as though they'd been pressed into place with machine-like precision. I couldn't fathom who would do that or why, but the strangest part, The detail that made my pulse hammer was that there wasn't a single footprint or tire mark anywhere. It was as if the barrier had materialized out of thin air. I decided to move a few of the smaller bales aside, just enough to clear a path for my truck. Each bale felt heavier than it should, and the texture was oddly compact, but I managed to create a gap wide enough the damp odor intensified as I shifted them, my breathing growing ragged from the effort. Once I was satisfied, I trudged back to the cab, started the engine, and slowly eased my truck forward. Crossing that line of hay felt like crossing an invisible threshold. I remember an instant where the lights seemed to flicker, not the headlights, but everything around me, as if the world blinked. That first crossing was uneventful, at least that was my initial impression. After a few miles, I noticed I had no signal on my phone, so I couldn't call ahead to let my contact know I was running late. The darkness of the road was absolute, broken only by my truck's beams. Finally, I spotted a lonely gas station sign up ahead. It looked older than any station I'd visited in recent memory, with peeling paint and flickering neon that hissed in the quiet. I felt a surge of relief at the prospect of a working phone, or at least a place to gather my thoughts. But as I pulled in, the station itself seemed off, like it belonged to a different decade. The pumps were ancient, the windows dusty. I stepped inside, greeted by a single overhead bulb casting a sickly yellow glow on stained floor tiles. I asked the attendant if I could use the station's phone, since my cell phone showed random symbols instead of bars. He replied in a flat tone that their landline was down. Although I couldn't see a phone anywhere, I thought maybe they kept it behind the counter. Something about his eyes made me uneasy, like he was trying to comprehend the fact that I was there but couldn't fully register me. I mentioned the road closure and the hay bales, but he looked at me as though I'd asked a nonsense question. He gave a vague shrug, and I felt a surge of frustration. I left a few bills on the counter for coffee. I didn't even finish, and hurried out, more unsettled than when I arrived back in the truck. I tried calling my contact again this time. The phone displayed a different area code for him, one I didn't recognize. My chest tightened. I chalked it up to some glitch. Maybe the phone was messing up because of a spotty signal. I forced myself to ignore the wave of unease creeping through me. The rational part of my mind insisted it was just an isolated anomaly, something that would fix itself once I got to a more populated area. When I returned to the road, it felt endless, repeating the same curve of farmland over and over after hours that felt like days. I finally spotted a diner, its neon sign blinking with half the letters out. Relieved to find a place that might be open, I parked and went inside. A single overhead fan rattled as it spun, stirring the stale smell of old grease and burnt coffee. The waitress behind the counter looked up, asked me if I wanted the special of the day. The strangest thing happened when I asked if they had a payphone. She gave me a puzzled look and said they had never had a payphone. Though I could swear I saw one mounted near the entrance, I turned to point it out, but the space was just a faded rectangle on the wall, as if something had been ripped away. My hand trembled slightly at this point, and I couldn't tell if it was from fatigue or rising panic. I asked her in a more urgent voice than I intended if she'd ever heard of a road blocked by hay bales. She shrugged. She claimed no knowledge of any closure in my mind. Alarm bells were clanging. I paid for a bland sandwich and left quickly, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. The entire time, my heart pounded so loud I half expected someone else to hear it. Unable to shake the tension coiling in my gut, I decided to drive back the way I came, convinced I'd find that barrier again and see if there was another path. When I returned to the spot, my flashlight revealed something that made my breathing go shallow with dread. The hay bales were back, rearranged in a different configuration, as if they'd sprouted roots and realigned themselves with a malevolent intent. My earlier gap was gone. I felt a trickle of cold sweat slide down my temple. The night was utterly still, except for the frantic thud of my pulse in my ears. I could see the faint outline of my own footprints from before, but they stopped abruptly in front of the new arrangement of bales. I dragged the bales aside once more, fear needling at me the entire time. I tried to reassure myself, telling my scattered mind that maybe some local farmer had put them back to keep trespassers out. But deep down, I knew something else was at play. something I couldn't name or rationalize. When I crossed the threshold the second time in my truck, the flicker was stronger. It was as if the night itself momentarily brightened, revealing a swirl of shapes just beyond my line of sight. My stomach lurched and a twisting sensation rushed over me like I'd driven through a vortex. Once on the other side, I realized my phone's entire contact list was jumbled. Numbers I had memorized for years were entirely different. Names were spelled incorrectly, and when I tried to call the dispatch office, a stranger answered. My throat went dry. I found it increasingly hard to breathe, and a wave of dizziness threatened to overwhelm me. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself I needed to keep calm, but an insistent voice in my head whispered that I was on the wrong side of something unexplainable. Over the next hours, the changes grew more pronounced. The route markers on the road bore numbers that didn't align with any map I'd ever used. The farmland looked subtly rearranged barns in different colors, fields planted in unfamiliar patterns. My truck's dashboard clock froze at 3:13 a.m. and wouldn't budge. Panicking, I turned on the radio for some comforting static or local station chatter, only to find all the frequencies out of tune. There was a persistent hum rising and falling in waves, scratching at the edges of my sanity. When dawn finally arrived, it came with a sluggish, murky light, tinted gray rather than the normal pale gold. I expected the farmland's shadows look stretched at bizarre angles I drove on, searching for any sign of normalcy. That was when I noticed the rattle in my engine, popping the hood. I tried to do a quick inspection, but every label and brand name inside was off by a letter or two, as though the world was mocking me with these tiny, infuriating differences. My fingers shook so badly I dropped my wrench and I nearly tripped retrieving it. I wanted to scream at the sky at the unrelenting weirdness that refused to make sense. I must have spent hours trying to find a main highway, but every route twisted back on itself or led to a dead end. Occasionally I glimpsed signs of people, distant farmhouses, dim silhouettes in windows, yet whenever I tried knocking on a door, I was met with either silence or residents who looked at me with unblinking suspicion. They seemed to listen to my questions about the road and the barrier, but they responded with vague phrases that made my head spin. No one gave me a clear answer, no one offered real help. It felt like they were seeing a ghost, but pretending not to. After crossing the barrier a third time because I had no choice but to keep backtracking, I noticed changes in my personal belongings. My watch no longer bore the brand name. I recognized the company name had switched 2 letters. My license had a different issue date, and the photo looked slightly off, like it was of a different version of me. My body tensed and my breathing quickened. In short, panicked bursts, I started to suspect that every time I passed those hay bales, I slipped farther away from my original reality. Anxiety devoured me. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being herded, like some invisible force was guiding me across the barrier again and again, nudging me through fracturing layers of existence every time I tried to break the cycle, turning onto a side road, ignoring the direct route. I ended up at that damn wall of hay, always changed, always waiting. My pulse pounded in my ears each time I saw it, and a nervous tremor claimed my hands. The more I the barrier will appear again, or that a subtle shift in reality will yank the ground out from under me. I have this overwhelming sensation that I'm being observed, evaluated by forces I can't see, or name the world outside the window is bathed in the sickly color of a sun that isn't quite right. I plan to drive somewhere, anywhere, looking for the faintest chance of stumbling across my true reality, but deep down I suspect I'll never find the exact version of home I left behind. That thin line of hay bales may rise up again, and each crossing might just take me further away. My only hope is that if I persist, if I keep searching, I'll eventually slip back into the world that feels like my own. Yet a darker thought gnaws at me. Maybe my reality is gone, replaced one crossing ago. Maybe all that remains is this series of distorted reflections stretching out infinitely as I put the key in the ignition. Every nerve in my body screams in protest, telling me to stay put to avoid whatever lurks beyond. But I can't live in stagnation, fearing the next flicker of reality. I have to keep moving forward, even though I feel dread gnawing at the base of my skull. My hands tremble on the steering wheel. My heart pounds so fiercely I can taste the metallic tang of adrenaline in the back of my throat. I don't know what waits on the road ahead, or if there's a way back to the life I once knew, but I can feel the barriers pull beckoning in the distance, waiting to separate me from yet another version of myself. There's no comfort in that knowledge, only a raw terror that twists my stomach into knots. Still, the engine hums and I roll forward, headlights cutting through the uncertain twilight. If this is my fate, forever crossing between parallel roads, I can only hope that one day I'll cross back into the right one. Yet even now, I fear that sense of belonging will never truly return. My world has shifted and I'm not sure it will ever align again.